Happy 2 for Tuesday, and welcome to another chapter of An Honorable Mention, the essential Ring of Honor retrospective podcast covering the most successful independent wrestling promotion of this generation. I am your host, Jeff Schwartz, and alongside is my co-host, our expert analyst, Ring of Honor alumni, Shane Hagadorn. Shane, how are you today?
I have amazing news for anyone who may have followed our updates on Twitter or Instagram or any of that. I actually learned what an Amazon Echo is. And not only that, I attempted to win one in one of those arcade stacking games. And I was one block away from winning myself an Amazon Echo and failed.
Oh, that's disappointing. I was hoping that I didn't know this story going in, so I was hoping that the payoff was, and I won one.
Nope. As anybody who traveled with me on the road, Grizzly Wood in particular knows, I'm god-awful at claw machines or any of those kind of games. So the fact that I got one brick away from almost winning an Echo was pretty epic for me.
Well, shout out to my good friend Tyler Graysmith, who is the king of the claw machine. He would have won that Amazon Echo. I've spent many a time at a Dave & Buster's location with him where he has come home with a giant stuffed bear, all sorts of just useless, non-essential items that he just simply won with the drop claw. I've never seen anybody like it. He's a machine. So the drop claw machine was a victim. It did not bring us an Amazon Echo this week, but we do have other news this week to discuss, and that is that this week we're going to cover the greatest Ring of Honor World Champion of all time, Samoa Joe. And I'm super excited to get into it. We have, once again, a plethora of social media to go over with you guys. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at the Jeff Schwartz. That's where I'm at on both locations. You can find the podcast on Instagram and Twitter at An Honorable Pod. And that's also our Facebook, facebook.com/An Honorable Pod. Shane, where can we find you on Twitter?
At Hagadorn Shane.
Everybody go follow and provide us some social media interaction, because Lord knows we don't get enough of that. Especially me, and my 600 tweets a day. But we're also going to plug our providers for our podcast before we get into our topic this week. iTunes, SoundCloud, the Google Music Play Store, Amazon Echo. We're available there, even though we didn't get one. Personally, I think they should send us one each. As long as it's not listening to us. We're also available on iHeartRadio, which is a big platform for us to get on. We're very happy to be partners with them. And Stitcher. You can find us there. But we are very excited today to partner up with all those great providers who have graciously allowed us to grace their airwaves and share our product that we're so passionate about with you guys. So this week, I think it's time to dig into it. I think it's worthy of an honorable mention. Samoa Joe, 2003 to 2005. We'll start off with a quick Samoa Joe bio, just as we did on our Chris Hero profile that was the last episode. We hope you enjoyed that. Nafalu Joel Shinoa was born March 17, 1979 in Orange County, California, specifically in the Huntington Beach part of Orange County. He spent time during his childhood in Iwa Beach in Hawaii. His family's his father's side on his family owned a Polynesian dance troupe called Tiare Productions. And I learned the official pronunciation of that thanks to our subject today. This expansion of Joe's personal life peaked when he was 5 years old, and he performed in the 1984 Summer Olympics. Shinoa was a junior state champion in judo, all-league in football for Ocean View High School. In his time away from the ring, Joe is also a mortgage broker and owns several real estate properties in Florida and California. His initial training in professional wrestling came from Cincinnati Red and Johnny Hemp. His debut match was in December of 1999 against Uncle Jess Hansen, only 3 months into training before he was put in the ring. Before debuting with Ring of Honor in 2002, Joe worked for UPW, 01 in Japan, as well as many indies throughout California. His Ring of Honor debut, of course, came against Low Ki at Glory by Honor, the very first Glory by Honor in October of 2002, when he was hired to take on Low Ki, the mortal enemy of Christopher Daniels. He was a hired assassin, and this impressed Ring of Honor officials enough to make Joe a regular going forward. In the time while he was working for Ring of Honor, he worked for IWA Mid-South, Cleveland All-Pro Wrestling, PWG, Jersey All-Pro, and many other European promotions, as well as 01. Joe is a frequent trainee in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, Muay Thai, and has always been an avid tech geek and video gamer. And as I once called him, a nerd, and then he slapped me. So, the very first match with Samoa Joe in Ring of Honor is the Fight Without Honor against Low Ki at Glory by Honor, which was October 5th, 2002 in Philadelphia at the Murphy Rec. And the first thing I want to point out before we even get into discussing the match was a very young Tom Bobo, legendary ROH fan, and a very young Evander Beati sitting in the very front row opposite of the hard cam. I know at least Tom for sure, but I'm pretty sure the both of them would travel from Grand Rapids on out to Philly for most shows. They were both at the Era of Honor Begins in February and are still as devoted fans as anybody I know today to the company. So bravo to both of them for continuing on. But yeah, they were across from the hard cam, and they're two really good friends of mine. So shout out to both those guys. But this match, you mentioned it to me via text. It was a very Kawada Misawa type match. Expand upon that a little bit.
So I probably hadn't watched this match in like 10 years maybe, and even then that was probably the second or third time I'd watched it since I first saw it in 2003, I want to say, is when I first started watching Ring of Honor. And it blew me away then. The hard hitting, the just intensity of that match was not like anything I'd ever really watched before. I hadn't been exposed to a ton of that Japanese strong style of wrestling. I'd seen like the Best of the Super Juniors tournaments and the J Cups, J Crowns, things like that, but that's more of like the cruiserweight style. I hadn't seen the All Japan, New Japan, the heavyweight style that this was very much akin to. So since, after wrestling, I started getting a lot of that footage more from different places, and just got more and more exposed to the Kobashi, the Akiyamas, the Kawadas, Misawas, that style, Tenrus. And so I watch this back now, and that's all I see. I see this match almost as like an homage, a tribute, an attempt to do what those guys did. Because you forget watching this match, these Joe and Ki at this point are still pretty, they're experienced, but they're still relatively new in their careers in 2002.
Yeah, Joe was not quite even 3 years in. Low Ki was a little over 4 years into things. So essentially on the scale of green, they were, just kind of getting to that point of not being green.
Mm-hmm. And it shows. So I watched the match, and it's a lot of like almost as if you're attempting to ape this style, but not quite nailing it. a lot of those matches are based, they build on each other. The Kawada, Nakayama, like all of their matches, they build on each other. Some of those matches, you'll see them open the match with hitting their finishers, which, by the way, I hate it when commentators refer to people's signature moves as finishers.
Because they never finish.
The first thing Akiyama hits in a match is the wrist clutch exploder, and then you see a burning hammer. Like, why are those the first two moves in an entire match when they are technically the finish? Because they've had all these other string of matches that they've built upon, that these guys know each other that well, that they're just throwing their bombs out there right from the get-go. This match, watching it back, it's still an intense, hard-hitting battle that's not like anything else that I had seen. Still, at that point, like 2002 Indies, I still think this was pretty groundbreaking. But it's also their first match against each other in Ring of Honor, and they're going at it like it's their 100th match. And
we never really got a rematch out of it either, a one-on-one rematch. No. So there wasn't. It's one of those matches that, looking back on it, you say to yourself, like, oh my God, what could have been if Low-Ki was willing to do business?
I never got the impression, I mean, this is kind of, just get into it now since it's relevant, is I never got the impression from Gabe that he ever wanted to have them do a singles match again. I always got the impression it was just finding ways to have them against each other, whether it be in tag matches or the four-way later in Joe's title run, without having a one-on-one match between the two of them again. Partially, I think, to keep that singles match special.
And really, I mean, we're 16 years almost removed from it, and it still is very special. You said you hadn't seen it in about 10 years. I haven't seen it in probably longer. I watched it a couple of days ago. I watched it again this morning. We're taping this on Tuesday the 12th of March, or Monday the 12th of March. And I watched it again while I was doing cardio this morning, and I just kept thinking to myself, like, God, these two guys, the influences of Puro heavyweights from All Japan and New Japan and what would eventually become Noah and 0-1 as well, which you'll see at the end of the match. The Kawada kicks immediately from Low-Ki to start the match. I said, oh, there's the Kawada influence. We're already starting. They did stuff that at this point you saw Low-Ki have amazing matches with Bryan Danielson, with Christopher Daniels, the three-way, obviously, at the opening show, the four-way for the title that was 16 minutes long, the AJ match. You had, but this was like a whole other like stratosphere that Low-Ki ascended to, and it was one of those things where you mentioned that all those Puro heavyweight matches in Japan, they were all built on what had happened prior. And you see things in this match that Joe calls back to all the way down, like through his whole run in Ring of Honor. Joe was somebody I would call the king of the callback, because you'll see later in matches with like Chris Daniels, the one that at the following year, Glory by Honor for the title, he's literally being built up and doing stuff. And then you see it in the Dragon Gate Challenge match, the Vendetta match. There's all these things that happen in those matches that relate back to the very first one-on-one match. And Samoa Joe as a wrestler, not only does he look the part of killer, when you put him against Low-Ki, who looks like he could kill you, it really was this incredible collision of, I guess like a Batman versus Superman, just without all the terrible DC stuff. It was two alpha male badasses just beating the hell out of each other. And there were points today where I just kind of shook my head while I was on the bike, and people would walk by and they'll be like, would glance at me oddly, and I don't know if I was just shaking my head, obnoxiously, or if I was like, oh Jesus, out loud. But these two guys beat the crap out of each other. And
yeah, there were spots in this that made me wince watching it back, and it's like you couldn't get much better of a debut for somebody either. This was the perfect way to introduce Joe to the Ring of Honor audience. He was, it was a moniker that he would be attached to him in TNA later, but the Smashing Machine, the Samoan Smashing Machine, and that was perfectly what he was in this match. It was just a violent, brutal war that also gave fans going forward an expectation for what a fight without honor should be. This was the first one, and it set the bar really high. And it set that bar without any blood or weapons. It was just a physical battle. And Joe had that monster presence. Both men had a presence, but Joe had that monster presence, and he was the first person in Ring of Honor to have that monster presence.
And the idea that he's being credited as the assassin, the hired assassin, you expect some sort of like standout personality, standout look, and he looked the part, even with that goofy bleach blonde hair. He looked like a killer, and he was presented as such. And even though he lost via knockout, the way he sold the knockout at the end, where he's looking into the camera and portraying as if he couldn't believe he was knocked to the ground, and pinned. It really solidified Samoa Joe. To me, this was the first time I had ever seen him. It solidified him as like, okay, this guy's really awesome, and I'm hopping on that bandwagon.
It's a great example of winning by losing.
Yeah.
Joe lost the match, but he was a made man for the Ring of Honor fans in that one loss.
Yeah,
and that it gave you an idea of what you would get going forward from a guy who, as far as I understood it, this is all as a fan. I was not even training yet, much less working in the office. A guy who I always got the impression this was supposed to be a one and done, but he ended up, working the rest of 2002, and then it just get into 2003 when he really slowly became the face of Ring of Honor.
And that's kind of the way that, we can perfectly surmise the rest of 2002 pretty succinctly. At All-Star Extravaganza, which was in November, that took place also at the Murphy Rec in Philly. Joe and the Prophecy of Christopher Daniels and Donovan Morgan defeated Doug Williams, Homicide, and Low Key in 23 minutes, 45 seconds. This, for whatever reason, was a six-man tag for the Ring of Honor Tag Team titles. I don't know how that would have worked. Had the babyface team won, but so be it. Then, a week later, Joe is flown to Wakefield, Massachusetts for Scramble Madness, where he spends 1 minute and 50 seconds in the ring with the Ring Crew Express of Dunn and Marcos, and he defeats them both in a handicap match. Then that would eventually lead to Homicide defeating Samoa Joe, their first encounter, the same evening. Joe did a lot of double duty and a lot of 2-on-1s early on in the first couple of months. Almost to maybe have something for the website or the TV show maybe that Ring of Honor had at the time. At Final Battle, the very first Final Battle, he does a dark match with two names that probably will not get brought up on this podcast for a long time, if ever again. The Outcast Killas, Diablo Santiago and Oman Tortuga. And then he would participate later in the evening in a number one contendership trophy four-way with American Dragon, Low Key, himself and Steve Corino that went to a 45-minute draw. I don't have anything to say about that match. It was, other than that, it was just weird. It just didn't work. It was weird. You had so much talent, but it was almost like everyone was giving so much that nobody got anywhere. And that ends 2002. It builds the beginning of what would be in 2003. The first two matches of 2003 for Samoa Joe. In January, on the 11th, in West Mifflin, Pennsylvania, at Revenge on the Prophecy, Samoa Joe would defeat the American Dragon, Bryan Danielson. I don't remember much of the match at the time, and I don't remember thinking, wow, this is amazing. However, and we'll talk a little bit more about this show in detail, the one-year anniversary show at the Elks Lodge in New York City, Bryan Danielson defeated Samoa Joe, so he got his win back in 15 minutes, 21 seconds, and I thought by far this match, in terms of the chemistry, the timing, and the drama built into Danielson conquering Samoa Joe, was, this was a money match.
Mm-hmm. Money match to go back to, and it was a long time before they went back to it.
Yeah.
I mean, that was almost over a year, I think, before we went back to them in any kind of singles match. And but the thing I think with this match though is anything else on this show is overshadowed by the Riot,
yep.
Which Joe took part in because of the whole weird prophecy versus we don't have a name, but we're the group. Essentially Carino's 0-1 is what it was. It was a 0-1
Yeah, it was Team 0-1.
C.W. Anderson, Joe. So remember, Joe was never part of the prophecy. Officially, he was just a hired gun. So he goes off and officially joins the group with Steve, who had
C.W. Anderson.
Then he had taken Simply Luscious from Daniels.
Correct.
And then Daniels took Alice in Danger, who was Steve's sister, and it was just this weird. I mean, like I said, even as watching as a fan back then, I was like, okay, I don't understand any of this right now. It's just like.
It was very confusing, and Michael Shane was somehow involved too with the group, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little later on, I believe, but Jack Victory too, also in there. Yep. A long time Steve Corino associate, but this Riot in particular is something that has to be seen by any Ring of Honor fan, because a lot of it was planned, but I think it got out of hand to the point where, at that point, all bets were off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was legitimate brawling with fans, stuff that made the DVD, legitimate, like, wrestler on fan violence, fan on wrestler violence. You see a lot of, like, independent guys in the crowd, especially some guys from like Jersey All Pro.
Like the Doghouse guys.
Basically the Doghouse, Low-Key and Homicide's training center, Monster Mac, Danny Moff, all those guys. This just monstrous clusterfuck of, I don't even know what you would. It's a riot, but like on a wrestling show, it's not something you can ever create. It was just like this organic game changer, really, because it kind of set Ring of Honor away from being the work rate match promotion to, whoa, they can do this holy shit type stuff where you're just like, we don't know what's real, what's a work.
Yeah, it left enough people guessing. We can get into it more if and when we address the show itself, but it left enough people guessing of, was this a work? Was this a shoot? Myself included. And when I first read about it, I was like, is this legit? Is this, how legit was it? And then, once they get involved, finding out that, to some of the people involved, like, it got pretty legit. I think, like, Logan DeVito, like, talking to them about it, and it kind of got, like you were saying, it got heated, and I'm sure, you didn't necessarily know too if you're just getting hit from behind by one of the boys. You don't necessarily know if it's a fan who's getting involved in this. It was absolute and total chaos that.
And
the DVD, I can only imagine actually being there that day. What it would have been like being a fan in the audience that day. But watching it on tape, it's chaos. It just gets. Watching it on DVD, they show it like 700. It literally is like a half an hour of the DVD gets eaten up by every possible camera angle and replays, and it just kind of beats you over the head with the idea that this was a shoot.
And
to the point that now it's 100% it's a work because of how much they're beating you over the head with the idea that it's a shoot.
Right. And the other thing is that like nobody was pulling punches in this. You weren't getting shots in the shoulder blades or in the neck region. Like, these guys were popping each other pretty good, and, a fan that's not trained is going to get hit, and, they're going to throw back, and the wrestler's not going to know it's a fan, so now you're just circling the drain of violence, and it gets out of control. But it's something that I recommend every Ring of Honor fan go see somewhere. I don't know if the DVD's available or if it's up on Honor Club, but this is one of those things that, as a wrestling fan, you should just see just for the visual entertainment of it. We move onward to March 15th to be specific, at Expect the Unexpected in Boston, Massachusetts, at the National Guard Armory. As Shane and I both do the amazing red hand gesture to each other as we're taping this on Skype.
Shout out to Ernie Osiris on that one because he still does it.
Yeah, that I didn't know, but that makes my day because I recently saw a basketball player do that after dunking the ball, and our whole bench saw me like laughing hysterically, and there's one wrestling fan on our team that's a big independent wrestling fan, and he did it after a dunk, and I was on the ground in my seat, and it was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. But on this show, number one contenders trophy match, it's a 4-way. It's Samoa Joe, BJ Whitmer, and Homicide, alongside Easy Money, former ECW star, WCW Cruiserweight at the end there. He was Jason Jett. They have a 16-minute, 35-second match. And basically, Easy Money is bumping around. Samoa Joe wins this. He becomes the number one contender for the Ring of Honor World title, which at this point is held by Xavier. Joe locks Easy Money in the Coquina clutch, and we get a tap-out victory, game, set, match. And Samoa Joe, your new number one contender. There's not much.
This time the move didn't even have a name. It was just the choke. They just always called it the choke. That choke. Gabe and whoever, I can't remember.
I think it was Donnie B
at this point, but there's just the choke, that deadly choke. They just made it a point to constantly put over the choke as a game ender. And
it was. Nobody ever got out of it at that point. I mean, you would see guys struggle and then escape, but once they were in it and it was fully locked in, that finisher was protected very heavily through the early portion of his run. And you can't say that about a lot of other finishing moves that this company had, including Low-Key's. And Low-Key, didn't really like going under to anybody. But we get to March 22nd, 2003. It's Night of Champions, and we're back at the Murphy Rec. And this show in itself was odd for a couple reasons. Number one, you have Joe getting his title shot, but at the same time, Joe is also in a headlining match that goes to a no contest with his team of C.W. Anderson and Jack Victory taking on Homicide and the Hit Squad of Mafia and Monster Mac. Joe, again, doing double duty. And Joe wins the title. He beats Xavier, who had defeated Low-Key back at Unscripted, I believe.
Yes.
And the thing to me about this match is not so much that Xavier was terrible or, he was just all right. He was a good, solid heel, but he didn't do anything super flashy. He didn't have that presence that Low-Key had. He didn't have the charisma of a Christopher Daniels. And in this match in particular, Michael Shane and C.W. Anderson are along with Joe at ringside, and Daniels and Danger eventually get them all away from ringside. And this becomes all about Samoa Joe. It's the first time that Samoa Joe is the centerpiece of a match with no backdrop, no factions, no nothing. It's just him and Xavier. And Joe becomes the Ring of Honor champion with the choke, the coquina clutch. The arm drops 3 times. And this was this dominant tone setter for a title run that I think Ring of Honor ever had. I'd really have to think about how Danielson's title reign started and Nigel's title reign started, and at least how they went into the match where they won the belt. But Joe was built up.
I could tell you Nigel's pretty easily. Nigel's lost 1 million times to win the belt.
Yeah, but he wore down Morishima to beat him for the belt. But without looking at the matches, I can't say there was a story here or whatever. It's just been so long. But Joe had this story where he dominated everything, and he only lost when it meant something. Like losing to Bryan Danielson, top guy. Losing to Low-Key via knockout, top guy. And, he was in a draw. He literally was built up as this monster and just plowed through Xavier in 12 minutes for the title.
I think Xavier deserves a little more credit in that I think that his role, I never had this conversation with Gabe about why Xavier, but I think his role was to be a heel who was going to get booed, but he wasn't so awesome that he was going to just get cheered either.
And that's the Christopher Daniels theory.
And didn't have that built-in respect from the fans. Like Christopher Daniels, even though, Ring of Honor is a company in its infancy at this point, Daniels had that built-in respect. Because it's Christopher Daniels at that point, he was an indie. He was already on his way to becoming an independent wrestling icon. People knew his name. Low-Key had earned it. Bryan at this point had earned it. Like Xavier was a guy who didn't earn his title match, really. Didn't win it in an honorable fashion, which is something they continue to put over throughout Joe's reign, is that he's an honorable champion. So he was perfect foil to be a heel champion for the company. That if you were a good little worker, had a good work rate, and put on great matches, you weren't going to get booed. So Xavier, I think, was the best person they could have possibly had win belt to be a heel for the company.
And I 100% agree with that. I think looking back at the roster at that point, there were no other options. You had Homicide stuck in a tag team with Boogaloo at the time. You had Amazing Red, but he was a babyface. You had all these different pieces and parts that hadn't quite been pushed up yet, or they just didn't exist yet. The CM Punks and Colt Cabanas of the world didn't even exist. to put the belt on. I mean, they were in the in IWA, and they had done a little bit of the East Coast stuff, but they hadn't really started at ROH yet.
They're fresh. They're new. I mean, unscripted was the same where they first showed up, but they were not back till December with Night of the Butcher, and then they were just they hadn't solidified themselves in the company yet to be anything.
And even as Steve Corino wasn't here full time, he was in and out. He could have been an option at least if we had known he had been here full time. So you had a lot of reasons that Xavier was the perfect guy. Established on the East Coast already, working for Jersey All Pro, ECWA, and he was kind of like the Arn Anderson to Christopher Daniels, Ric Flair, and he just fit the role perfectly. He was a great role player, and he fit this role. Joe is the champion now, leader in the night. The Hit Squad and the group go to a no contest. We head into April, and this is Samoa Joe's first title defense. We're in Philadelphia, still at the Murphy Rec Center for Epic Encounter. Samoa Joe takes on three men, the aforementioned Colt Cabana, Matt Stryker, and Reckless Youth Tom Carter.
The interesting thing, this was another double duty night, too. He beat Hot Stuff Hernandez earlier in the show, and then this happened, and they put him over, too. Like, it was smart booking that Joe got put over with this match because it wasn't announced as a title match. Joe made this a title match. Yep. I think it was one of those, like, the match was announced before he was even, who knows, the match was set before he won the championship, and then these guys hadn't earned a title shot yet, but Joe was like, no, I'm putting the belt on the line. I'm going to be a fighting champion, and then we don't need to go into too much detail, but this is the match. It's like, if I remember right, like, Joe's got Colt in the choke, and everyone's hitting moves on Joe. Well, Colt's in the choke, and he doesn't break the hold, and Colt, is done. It was just a match straight up like, here's your monster, and we're going to put him over three guys at the same time as strongly as you possibly could. But without it being three of your tippy-top guys, so you're not like...
You're not burying the top of your card.
You're not killing any contenders.
No, and that was the great thing about having Hot Stuff Hernandez on this show as well go against Joe, because Joe's facing a guy that's a little bigger than him, a very young and inexperienced guy, who, along with Paul London and Spanky and a whole host of Texas guys, would drive up from Texas to Philly for these shows. Masada is another one. They would all drive to Philly, Texas to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I mean, that's crazy. All to try and get your name out. And Hot Stuff Hernandez has made a living in this business, and so have several of those other guys I just mentioned. It's amazing, looking back on this match. I remember vividly the visual of those two standing eye to eye, or face to face, in the center of the ring, and Hot Stuff Hernandez is an athletic big guy, kind of in the mold of Mike Awesome, but he didn't really know. I guess he hadn't found his footing yet. I guess that's the best way to put it. So
yeah,
Joe carried him to a very uneventful 6-minute and 40-second match, and it was solid yet unspectacular, I guess. It was enough that it legitimized Joe as a badass against a bigger guy, that he could beat the super monster as opposed to just being a monster. But the one match that we are going to talk a little further about comes a couple of weeks later. It's in West Mifflin, Pennsylvania, and it is Retribution Round Robin Challenge 2. Samoa Joe and Doug Williams for the Ring of Honor World Title.
I think this show held the record for the longest Ring of Honor show title until we got to Honor Takes Center Stage chapters 1 and 2. I
didn't think about that, but yeah, you're right. This is the first time that there was any sort of card change. I remember the initial round robin challenge was supposed to be something completely different than what it was. This round robin challenge was Christopher Daniels, Paul London, and the Amazing Red. I want to say it should have been Low Key instead of Amazing Red, but I could be wrong on that. But
this one I don't even remember.
This match, it's a contrast in style, where Joe was very strong style. Doug Williams could mix it up, but he was a very mat-based guy, not typical in the European style, but did a lot of combination holds, a lot of submission holds, just a wide variety of styles of holds that he did, and had my favorite finisher of the early ROH days, that Chaos Theory, the rolling suplex into the German suplex. It looked awesome.
I was the same way. Absolutely, first time I saw him do this move, I fell in love with it, and it makes me so happy that Chad Gable uses it on TV now. To see that this move is being used on the main stage, the international exposure is makes me happy.
And that's the one of those like moves that it takes a lot of lower and upper body strength and coordination with that strength to do. You can't necessarily do it to everyone, but it seemed like Joe had no problem taking it.
Doug was a brick house. I mean, look at the dude. I mean, I don't even know if it's not even him and Joe. Like Joe's big and thick, but he's Samoan. Doug was like
yoked,
cut and thick, and his neck was just like he had that strong looking neck, and he was just I loved him because he was this mix of like what I think of now as the British strong style and the Johnny Saint style.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I guess that would be like the World of Sport style. That's not something I am, unfortunately. I've just never familiarized myself with a whole lot, but it's what I've seen. It's like he mixed in that the grappling that you tend to think of when you think of British wrestling with a really strong style that you also would see in Nigel down the line, with the very strong European uppercuts and forearms and just very like aggressive, as opposed to the other kind of British wrestling I think of would be more epitomized by like an Alex Shelley, when it comes to people in Ring of Honor. Doug was just a beast, and also like super polite and nice, and a really cool guy that when I finally got to actually meet him in like 2003 and 2004.
And that was kind of one of the things I wanted to ask about was with Doug. I mean, there was this odd fascination with him. Like Jody Fleisch had been around, and he was kind of the big British high flyer, and I felt like would have been somebody Ring of Honor used a lot more. Johnny Storm, same way. What was it that maybe made Ring of Honor go with Doug Williams on a more regular basis? Was he living in the States? Did he have some sort of connection to where he just flew himself over? And
well, around this point, I was still a good 6-7 months away from even being around. But when he came back in, it was more just like this guy. He was available. When they have their match down the line at Glory by Honor 3, I think it was more like Doug was available to us. He was the kind of guy who didn't have a lot of openings in his schedule, so when he had them, you did your best to get him in.
And they had a hell of a match. I would say of the early title defenses for Joe, and granted we're only at the third defense of the title, but this holds up right there with the Bryan Danielson matches, I would say, that Joe had early on in 2003 in February. January and February, that is. Joe wins, of course. He gets the tap out, and you really couldn't have asked for a more giving opponent because Doug really put in a lot of effort. But what happens next with Samoa Joe is arguably the most important decision that Ring of Honor made. They ran a co-promoted event at York Hall in Bethnal Green in England on May 17th of 2003. And Samoa Joe was on the show defending the Ring of Honor title against the Zebra Kid. And he defeated Zebra Kid, as you would expect. And the Ring of Honor title becomes the Ring of Honor World title. The level of prestige has been raised at Frontiers of Honor with the Frontier Wrestling Alliance of Alex Shane's promotion over in the UK and Ring of Honor co-promoting. Samoa Joe establishes the belt as a world title. So it's right on the level with every other, the WWF Heavyweight Championship, the WCW didn't exist at this point, but I don't know what that meant to the company itself at the time, but hearing that they made it a world title and actually went out of their way to do this showed that they were serious about growing this company. Especially
it was
the infantile stages.
Because it was kind of the same thing with the tag titles. A couple of years later when Roddy and Aries defended them in drag, or when we took them out and defended them, I guess in the UK shows and Dragon Gate and things like that. It was, you're not just going to go out and call your belt a world title because you want to. It was something that Ring of Honor earned. They earned it by actually defending the title in other countries, not just, hey, I'm a new indie and this is my world title. I get the point was to go out and actually earn the right to call it a world title. And then, as we'll see down the line too, Joe continued to do that. It wasn't just like a one-time affair. He would continue to defend it outside of the country on non-ROH events.
And he literally made it a point to take the belt with him when he would do indies. Most indies, they just keep their belts, and, the next time you show up the following month, hey, oh, there's my belt again. And Samoa Joe literally carried it with him, as he's the world champion. So, this was a big step going forward. And we get round 2 of Samoa Joe and Homicide on May 31st, 2003 at Do or Die. And this match goes 17 minutes and 14 seconds, and it really started the war between Samoa Joe and Homicide that, you would see grow throughout the rest of, the run that they had up until Samoa Joe was finishing up with the company and leaving. Headed over, to full-time to TNA. This, event was at the Murphy Rec in Philly, and when you think about Samoa Joe rivals, you think the very first name I think of is Homicide.
Me and you talked about it before, is what people would we classify Joe having rivalries versus feuds? And it's a fine line, but since you're going to think of something as a rivalry, it's a little bit more match-based and less of an angle. And Homicide's the main person I think of when I think of Joe having a true feud in Ring of Honor. And it started, the first match was a match, but the stuff with Homicide stemming out of the group, and then going from this match and going forward, it slowly escalated. It didn't require putting them together on every single show, especially when you only run 1 to maybe 2 shows a month. It's something that was drawn out, slowly built in little segments, backstage, in the ring, on the website. you don't have to shove it in front of people's faces every single show to remind them that it happens. You can do it in more subtle ways, and I think that's what happened with Homicide and with Joe. And there was always that constant, like, Homicide almost had it, or something outside of his control is the reason why he didn't win the title. Like this match, it was Key and Smokes is the reason he didn't win this belt after one of the sickest muscle busters Joe ever did was match.
Yeah, I would say that was a factor. I could think of off the top of my head the one he did in the dark match to TJ Wilson that ended his career was very similar in landing. The way Homicide landed. Homicide's very lucky that he didn't break his neck because he was slipping out of it as he was coming down. I mean, they went 17 minutes and 14 seconds. Looking back, other than that 45-minute draw where Joe had 3 guys in the ring with, this is the longest singles match that he has in Ring of Honor up until this point. And with Homicide, there's no slowing down in your match. You don't have time to take a break. You don't have time to sit down and, lock in a chin lock and catch your breath. He's constantly moving and going and fidgeting and just bouncing around all over the place. And he's beating the hell out of you because he'd never pulled a punch ever. And he embraced that. There's a story I'll tell later after one of the New York shows in 2005 that Homicide told me about working with Joe. That's pretty good. But this match was the quintessential start to their real feud, and it only escalated from here. Just wait, a year in advance from this show where we're at with these two guys. It's a blood feud, and Ring of Honor didn't do too many blood feuds over the title, and the title was essentially the backdrop when those two encountered each other. But we move on to June of 2003, June 14th, 2003, Night of the Grudges in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You're noticing a trend here every time Ring of Honor would visit the state of Massachusetts. They're in a different building. That became a running joke because I think they ran double-digit buildings in the Boston area off the top of my head. I can think of 6, and we've already covered
just
3.
In my time with the company, maybe 5.
So, I mean, they ran at least 10 different places in Boston, and I guess you could elaborate a little bit on why that was the case.
One building somebody got shot outside of. The other one was the Armory where we broke a window and we didn't go back. One of them was the Revere building that that sucked. A lot of time it was just the building sucked and we just tried to find different places that were sometimes, what building wasn't the most accessible to a highway. And that was always a big thing, was trying to, I know Sid and Ross, especially Sid was scouting building, was accessibility. Sometimes it didn't seem like it, but it was a mix of cost versus venue size versus accessibility to highways. Also, distance between shows. If it was a double shot, you don't want them too close together, so people are picking one over the other. You don't want you're trying to. It's not in finding a building is not as easy as just going and finding a building.
My favorite Boston building was one that I was never even in, but I've seen actual Polaroid pictures from it. It's a converted grocery store, and it was converted from a grocery store into just an open warehouse type place. And I want to say it was maybe the first Boston building, the Honor Invades.
Yeah, because that one I don't think I was ever in.
I saw Polaroids from that show, and I was just hoping some produce was left over and there was photos of that, but there wasn't. But on this show, Night of the Grudges at the National Guard Armory, the Prophecy and the group collide. The losing faction must disband. They cannot reband. They cannot come up with a new name. They must disband and separate. And this is the prophecy of Christopher Daniels, Danny Moff, who is no longer Moff as part of the Hit Squad, and Donovan Morgan. And they defeat the group of C.W. Anderson, Michael Shane, and Samoa Joe. So the faction must disband. The group is no more. At this point, I think there may have been an incident between Gabe and C.W. Anderson that led to his exit from the company. And
Sounds familiar.
I don't think Michael Shane was around too much longer after this because of TNA.
And neither was Donovan Morgan.
And Donovan Morgan, yes, also gone after.
He was, if I recall, he was a weird thing too, where he would make I swear I was told that he made up bullshit stories about not being told he wasn't allowed to do jobs. From Noah.
He was in Pro Wrestling
he
Noah.
Was like he was one of kind of almost like the original Gaijin for Noah. And I swear I remember being told that he was it's not that he would refuse to do jobs, it's that he was not allowed to.
Which, in a sense, is something I feel like probably was a legitimate statement to some people, but not to somebody on Donovan Morgan's level. That just seemed rather ridiculous to think. I know Mike Modest was a one and done for Ring of Honor, and he and Donovan were a tag team over in Noah back in this time period. So this is right around the time I started getting into Japanese pro wrestling. Pro Wrestling Noah piqued my fancy. The Kenta Kobashis of the world were, so drastically different than what I saw in the States. I became addicted to it, and you'd see the influence in the States with Joe, and it kind of made me appreciate Samoa Joe a lot more because he was implementing that style into his matches. And a perfect match that he implemented that style in is the Wrestle Rave 03 event at the Murphy Rec Center, June 28th, 2003. Samoa Joe defends the Ring of Honor World title against Danny Moff. He defeats him in 10 minutes and 37 seconds. And when I rewatched this match, I had not seen it since it came out on DVD. The Wrestle Rave 03 DVD, to my knowledge, is the shortest printed DVD in Ring of Honor history. And
it never got I shouldn't say it never got a second printing, because I think everything got a second printing once the logo changed.
Correct.
I feel like we did almost everything but Wrestle Rave. Everything would have gotten at least 1,000 DVDs, I think. But if it got any more than that, would be that all depended on how well it sold. I mean,
and this show
when
wasn't.
you saw stuff that was $5 sales, that's because we ordered 1,000 copies, and straight shooting with Jimmy Yang DVD-R wasn't moving enough to even have 1,000 copies.
And if you look at this show, there's not a whole lot that necessitates a must-see. I mean, the main event was Tables and Ladders, Trent Acid, and Homicide. And then you had an NWA World Title match with AJ and Chris Sabin on top. So your Ring of Honor World Title match is right in the middle of the show. And the most famous thing for me from this show was the CM Punk promo at the end, which to this day is the most believable promo I think I've ever seen in Ring of Honor. The amount of passion and selling and the blood and the look on his face as he's delivering the promo was incredible. But the rest of this show looks like, nothing. The opening match was the Ring Crew Express against Jimmy Jack Cash and Prince Nana. Not exactly what we would see 2 or 3 years later. Alexis Lurie who is Mickie James, and Sumi Sakai. Sumi Sakai is still around in Ring of Honor.
She's still going, yep.
Still going. He had a Chad Collier, Matt Striker tap-out match. And then Just Incredible, DeVito, and Loke teamed up as the Carnage Crew to take on Deranged, Dixie, and Izzy of Special K. There was also a Fatal 4-Way with a four-corner survival match, Fatal 4-Way, whatever. BJ Whitmer, Alex Shelley, Jimmy Jacobs, Tony Mama Luke. And then the Second City Saints of Punk and Cabana with Lucy Fur, a.k.a. Daphne, against Chris Daniels and Raven with Allison Danger, filling out the Wrestle Rave 03 show. So, but the key element here is Joe and Danny Moff are two big fans of Japanese wrestling, and they do a lot of spots that you would see in a Kobashi or a Misawa match. And when I got this DVD, it would have been probably October-ish of 03. There was a Misawa Kobashi match, I want to say August of 03, that had made its way to Morpheus, one of those downloading sites like Kazaa that I found. And they did like 2 or 3 spots in this match that they had directly taken from the Kobashi Misawa match. And I was like, oh my god, these guys saw that same match. I wonder, where the connection is.
Oh, come on. You know by now that wrestling it's to some degree recycling stuff that you saw in other matches. And, I mean...
This is where that all clicked with me, though. That independent wrestling was just trying to imitate Japanese wrestling.
See, and then, so I'm going to take it one step further and kind of rewind back to Joe and Key match. So take that match, and me and Anthony Franco wrestling for Worldwide Wrestling Alliance at Zern's Farmers Market. This is maybe my 5th or 6th match, maybe 10, somewhere in my first 10 matches I've ever had, and we just completely rip off the Snapmare back kick spots, completely ripped them off, and it was wow. And then we also, in that same match, also ripped off the AJ and Punk lock up, struggle, fall through the ropes, roll around the outside ring, completely ripped it off. That match is on YouTube somewhere because Eric Santamaria hates me enough to put that up on YouTube.
Well, Eric, we're going to be putting that one up on our Facebook page so we can embarrass our illustrious co-host.
Yeah.
And because I really want to see it. So I will be hunting that down on YouTube as soon as we're done taping today.
It's on my official YouTube page.
Oh.
I've kindly collected all of the good and bad and really awful garbage I have put on YouTube over the years in one location, so you can just go get it from my official Shane Hagadorn YouTube account.
Well, let's plug that YouTube account one more time then, so all of our listeners can go check out the annals of your career.
Yes. Yeah, youtube.com/Shane Hagadorn probably.
Well, speaking of people's careers who ended up going in unique directions, we're going to go to July 19th, 2003, the very first Death Before Dishonor event at the Rexplex in Elizabeth, New Jersey, home of Lance Thomas of Duke basketball fame and Jay Lethal of Ring of Honor fame. Samoa Joe defeats the Ring of Honor exiting Paul London. And Paul London makes this wonderful, heartfelt goodbye speech after the match. And it was one of those moments that Samoa Joe kind of became a secondary player in. Even though he won the match and it felt pretty much like a squash. There was never really any point, in my opinion, where I felt like, oh, they're going to do a title change. And granted, both of us at this point are just watching this a couple months later, so we kind of already knew what had happened with the delay in the DVD release. But Paul cuts this heartfelt, like, emotional promo, and really, in a way, I felt like Paul London was the very first person to emotionally connect to individual fans. In this speech, you know, saying he wanted to take everybody out for milk and cookies after the show, like Andy Kaufman, which at the time I didn't know that was an Andy Kaufman thing until many years later. And then as I got to know Paul London over the years, he's become a pretty good friend of mine. Knowing his affinity for eccentricity and being a unique, just like if he saw a sign that said, "Hey, be a square peg," he would be a round hole and have no apologies for it. Paul London is, to this day, one of the nicest and most just fun to be around human beings. I know he doesn't do a ton of indie wrestling anymore, and that's really a shame. And I think WWE really missed the boat on him. Part of that's on Paul for his out of the ring behavior, but at the same time, his look, his abilities, everything about him, he had the complete package to be the next Shawn Michaels, the next Ricky Steamboat. And the way he delivered this speech after this match, you really felt like, okay, here's a guy that's just so happy to be headed toward greener pastures financially, and then he got there and realized, ugh, this is not what I want. And then he smiled when Vince McMahon got blown up by a limousine and got fired.
And what he could have done in that role, especially with his wonderful selling abilities, make other guys' stuff look great. That's what he did for Joe in this match.
Oh, hell yeah.
And that's kind of the beauty of, like, you know, I don't know if it still exists. I could care less. Go bootleg it off somewhere for all I care. But the Samoa Joe DVD, the Championship Legacy DVD, is what me and Jeff used for a lot of our reference points for this. So it's like watching this match structure. The way that Ross and I structured the DVD, you're watching the matches we chose. You're watching Joe evolve as the champion. And you're getting through right now, this is kind of like his dominant streak, and everyone he's just running through, and everyone's putting over all of his stuff amazingly. And so you get somebody who sells to the level that Paul does, being beaten to death by Joe. It further elevates that monster perception of Joe. He keeps building and building and building, and eventually it hits its apex, and then Joe has to start showing more ass and showing a little bit more vulnerabilities, and that's kind of the structure of Joe's entire title run, I felt, was this continuing to build his dominance, and all of his opponents, no matter their size or shape or whatever style they wrestled, Joe matched them. He matched them, and he hung with them, and he took it to them and shut them down. Didn't matter if they were going at him in the strong style, if they were going at him in the British wrestling, if they were trying to pull off some of the more high-flying stuff like a London. Joe could not be touched at this point. And this story that they told in this match was that Paul didn't have anything that Joe couldn't survive.
And that's one of the other interesting parts of this whole match was the crowd response. This was the first time ROH was at the Rexplex, and that was essentially what's now their Hammerstein Ballroom. At the time, this was their biggest venue, so you had a huge crowd. Jeff Hardy was on this show. Physically, he was on this show. Mentally, he was probably somewhere else, which is ironic considering the day we're taping this, he just got arrested for DUI again, and the Rexplex.
There's an interesting commentary. So knowing the fact that these matches are commentated after the fact, gave comments on there that Paul London is the reason that these people are here to see this show, not Jeff Hardy.
Yeah. I had forgotten about that, but you're right. That's one of those callbacks that as soon as it gets brought up, I didn't even remember. But in texting with a friend of mine that was at this show, he reminded me that this building was so loud for so long, and this show went past midnight. And I edited it into the notes that I had that this show, and by the time Paul London's speech was done, it was almost 1:45. First time in the building, in the Rexplex. Do you think the owners were very thrilled that this thing was going to almost 1 a.m.?
Jesus, the number of times that we ran over the times that we told people we'd be in the building and just ended up getting bills for, it was pretty much every single show. We would just lie, like flat out lie. Yeah, we'll be out of there by midnight. Out. Not the show over, be out of the building by midnight. Mm-hmm. We're lucky if shows were over by midnight half the time.
Yeah, marathon.
Much less ring crew cleared out by midnight.
Marathon shows. It's, that was the style back then. And when you look at what was on this card, pretty much everything went long. I mean, even that debacle three-way with Jeff Hardy, Joey Matthews, and Crazy K, that went 6.5 minutes, not including the 4 or 5 minute entrance that Jeff Hardy had by the time he sturdied himself on the ropes. That was about 5 minutes long. But truth be told, Paul London match was really the rocket ship for Samoa Joe. He took every bit of offense. He's gone against strong style. He's gone against violence from Homicide. He's gone against the European wrestling style of Doug Williams. Now he's gone against the High Flyer. And his next title defense is against the hard-hitting striker of BJ Whitmer. And when you look at the BJ Whitmer style, quote-unquote, BJ was a guy that just hit you hard. He was American strong style. He used the wrist clutch exploder. He used a lot of various suplexes, a lot of really hard, loud strikes. I remember seeing him for the first time in IWA Mid-South 3 years prior to this, in 2000. And BJ's level of the audio that he portrayed in hitting guys was so much louder than anybody else. And then you combine that with Samoa Joe, who hit harder than anybody. The sounds of this match made it for me. And from a personal perspective, before we, I guess, kind of delve into the match itself in specifics, this venue in Dayton, Ohio, the Montgomery County Fairgrounds, this was Wrath of the Racket. It was Jim Cornette's debut for Ring of Honor. He was the special guest. And Jim was a big part of this show. But this title match, in addition to being the first show at the Montgomery County Fairgrounds Coliseum in Dayton, it featured a lot of changes. And you had AJ Styles and Homicide teaming up with Julius Smokes in the main event to take on the Prophecy of Chris Daniels and Danny Moff. Homicide substituting for an injured Amazing Red. And again, you see the Homicide Christopher Daniels lack of really chemistry that they had. Two individually talented guys that had great matches with pretty much everybody else, and they just didn't click. Joe and BJ go 12:44. Whitmer is wearing this face mask. He had a broken nose. There's callbacks to the four-way that happened in West Mifflin, where Joe hit BJ across the face, probably as hard as ever been hit. This match itself, you see the welts on BJ Whitmer's body from Joe. You see the just the chops and the strikes having an effect on both guys' bodies. And for me, having Ring of Honor so close to home, this was essentially a 3.5, 4 hour drive for me. It almost made the show more important to me as a fan, having Ring of Honor coming to my home state. Shane, this was your first show as a fan. You were actually at this show. Talk a little bit about what necessitated you from, going down from Michigan to Dayton. What you thought when you saw the venue for the first time, the show, the match. Give it to me.
It was the first show that was close enough to my home to actually go to, and I had only in the last year or two before this, I'd kind of made friends with people who were active indie wrestlers in Michigan. So I had started going to some of the Michigan shows, like indie wrestling shows, NWA Great Lakes and some other ones, and one that was called PWF, which is ironically where I first saw Punk, Cabana, and Jimmy Jacobs, Gorgeous Gavin Starr, Yukon Braxton. And then a lot of people who I would come to find out were just backyard wrestlers who conned their way onto the shows, who weren't even trained. And I ended up doing backyard wrestling with them before I trained. So I found there was something about it was Punk, Cabana, who Jacobs, and Cabana told me the guys, I'm now forgetting his name. He was another, one of the guys in the show who would go on to apparently become a male stripper. Cabana told me, who kind of captured my interest on the show. I feel like his name was Lightning or Thunder or something along those lines.
That's not who I'm thinking of, but I do know one of those Midwest guys that came out of that Steel Domain did become a male stripper. God, what was his name? He never worked anywhere outside of the Midwest. Oh God, I don't know. It won't come to me. I don't think. I have to go.
Maybe he'll be able to tell us if I just said who was the guy that became a stripper. But those guys captured my interest on that the PWF shows, and so when I also saw, I started building up my Ring of Honor collection, which I got bootleg copies from the bootlegger himself, which I always found ironic. And I started seeing Punk and Cabana on these shows, and then it was like, I was so far up, from where Wrath of the Racket was, and I was probably at that point watching the 1-year anniversary show as far as how far behind I was on shows. But it was like, all right, Ring of Honor's close to me. I'm gonna go, and I want to go see these guys wrestle on these Ring of Honor shows. I had no idea what the card was. I had one buddy who was really excited, who went with me, who hadn't seen anything. He was very excited to come with me because of Cornette being on the show, and so that was his impetus for being my partner in the drive. Otherwise, I would have just gone by myself. So we drove down, and I probably in the couple weeks before the show, now that I got to know people, I realized how annoying I was because I was on the receiving end of them, but I was literally calling every other day. Are there going to be tickets available at the door? They're going to be tickets available at the door. They're going to be tickets available at the door. It was always Richie or Jimmy were the ones answering the phone as I would learn. So I'm sure I was super irritating. So I get to the Montgomery County Fairgrounds. Rest in peace, Montgomery County Fairgrounds, by the way. At least as we know it.
Yeah. Sad.
And I'm like, this is whatever. It's a building. I've been to enough indie shows at that point that I had very low expectations of what buildings would be. And getting in, and it's very at that point, the building, literally half of the building is empty, as you know. It's that kind of taking half of the building, cutting it in half, and then curtaining it off, and it was really full at that point. The bleachers, this is where I sat. I was watching the match, trying to see if I could find myself, but I'm just off hard camera where I was sitting. I was sitting on the last possible seat in the top row of the bleacher, made my fin thick. And I just remember watching the show and not being super familiar with everybody on the show at this point, but just I was in awe. It was one of the most awesome wrestling spectacles I had seen, because most indie wrestling shows you're getting a lot of dreck. And even the bad stuff on this show is better than some of the good stuff on your average indie wrestling show. So it was an awesome experience for me. I bought a ton of tapes that day from Ross at the merch table. And then the thing that changed my life ultimately was the fact that on all of the seats at this event were flyers saying, keep an eye on ringofhonorwrestling.com for information about a school opening up under the training of CM Punk. And I immediately told myself when I saw that flyer in August of 2003 that I was going to do this. I made up my mind that I was going to do this. And going to that show changed my life. It's funny to think about that Dayton, Ohio changed my life. but yeah, Montgomery County Fairgrounds, Dayton, Ohio, BJ Whitmer, Samoa Joe, The Prophecy, Red, AJ, Special K,
Homicide,
the SAT murdering Cloudy, I think, on that show. All of that, like, that changed the direction of my life, completely choosing to go to that show.
And that's the amazing part of kind of our mutual friendship, is that Dayton building has played such an important role in the way, both of us know each other. It was the first place I worked, helped setting up and tearing down. It was the first place that, I got to take all of my friends to a show at. In the city of Dayton itself is not somewhere somebody that lives in the state of Ohio frequents. You go to Columbus, you go to Cleveland, you go to Canton to the Football Hall of Fame, you go to the Rock Hall in Cleveland, you go to Ohio State and Columbus. You don't really do much in Cincinnati because we consider that to be part of Kentucky, and Toledo is part of Michigan. So we have, and Youngstown is basically Pennsylvania. So, Cleveland, Canton, Columbus, those are our staples in Ohio. So when Ring of Honor started running Dayton, I thought, oh man, this is amazing. It's close, but it's kind of far away. And I remember the first time I went down to Dayton, my buddy drove, and we stayed at his grandparents, and we had Shattuck's Pizza, and it was a whole experience to do this. So I know what that drive is like as a fan, and just thinking oh my God, this is amazing. It's such a small world that this building that's now no longer going to exist, which just breaks my heart, because it was a dump, but it was my dump.
Exactly.
And
without a door.
Yeah, the bathroom stalls with no doors, and that weird I don't know whether it was a mixed drink cart or whatever it was that was in the left-hand corner when you walked in, and the food stand, and then you had the merchandise table set up, not the pro shop. It's a merchandise table. Let's get that across. And just all the memories I have in that building, and the people I met and the people I became friends with, lifelong friends with now, all these years later, it really, makes me kind of sentimental to think I was 16 when I started going to that building, and now I'm 32. I'm double my age, and you're even older.
I'm 67.
That's right. You're not going through a midlife crisis at 27 like a friend of mine that I recently had dinner with. But we'll not mention any names there. We'll just move on to bitter friends, stiffer enemies in Fairfield, Connecticut. It's Samoa Joe. That's how
you have to say it. When you say stiffer, it's stiffer.
Stiffer. It's my best Vince that I can do. Bitter friends, stiffer enemies. In Fairfield, Connecticut, in case you didn't know, that's a part of the United States of America. Samoa Joe defeats CM Punk in their very first match that they ever had together. 13:06 they went, and honestly, if you had told me that years later that these two would have 3 of the single best matches in company history, I probably would have said to you, I don't think I'll take that bet. This didn't really do much for either guy.
It was just a match. It was just a match. I mean, it's a good match. Nothing wrong with it. It's a match.
And
what I appreciated about the match was the fact that it wasn't like, oh, we're having a show, Joe has to defend the title. There wasn't a challenger for him, so he wrestled a non-title match. You know, there was the one nice thing I appreciate going through this set is every single match, I'm like, you know why the person who's getting the title match is getting this title match. Whether the commentators make a point to tell you that so-and-so won the number 1 contenders trophy, or Moff's getting this match because he pinned Joe in the 6-man tag, or as you'll see with the match he has with Jay Briscoe, that match happens because of a win in another match. Like every title match, they're not being done just so the title's defended on a show.
And that's the great thing about this show in itself is you could let Samoa Joe be a role player, and it didn't affect the quality of the show. Because this was one of the better shows, especially in Connecticut. I mean, Connecticut was always a kind of the B market before somewhere when they started doing double shots. And you look at this show, you had Daniels and Xavier in a Battle of the Prophecy for the number 1 contendership trophy. You had Homicide and Carino, which was a big rivalry. Low-Key and Danny Moff. An invitation to the Field of Honor match between Matt Striker and BJ Whitmer, which we can laugh at the Field of Honor all we want. And maybe one day that whole fiasco will get a show unto itself, because
that whole thing almost got a compilation DVD.
Oh God.
We put it together.
Ugh.
Never released it, never sent it even for production, for like reproduction, but we put it together.
I mean, if that would have been released, over or under 10 copies get sold.
Matt Striker would have bought 10 copies.
There you go. Exactly what I was looking for. But, you know, and then you had a real eclectic 4-way on this match that actually was pretty good when you consider who was in it and their level of experience. You had Deranged, Hydro, who would be Jay Lethal, and Johnny Storm, who's from the UK, and Slick Wagner Brown, managed by April Hunter. That 4-way I remember pretty much in detail, which the look on your face is a shock. But it was actually very fun. It was better than the flippy tag team scramble match with Special K, the Backseats, the Carnage Crew, and the SAT earlier in the night. For whatever reason, those 4 just clicked, and I like that match a lot, actually.
I'll have to watch it.
Go back, watch it. It's definitely better than the 15-minute time limit draw. It's better than Tony Mamaluke's tag team with John Walters as the Purists against Dunn and Marcos that went 2 minutes 34 seconds. Yeah, it's a fun match. But that match in itself with Joe and Punk, which is where we're going with this, it started something. There was something that both of those guys figured out in that match that would lead to many greater things down the line. We do want to go to the next show, Beating the Odds, which was in Wakefield, Massachusetts. It was on 9/6 of 2003, so September 6th, 2003. That would be the number 1 contendership 4-corner survival match. And looking at the talent in this match, you had Samoa Joe, who was basically eliminating contenders at this point. AJ Styles, Chris Sabin, and Jay Briscoe. And Jay Briscoe wins the match. So Jay Briscoe is now your new number 1 contender for the Ring of Honor World Title. After having been, I would say, I guess you would call him a tag team wrestler who did singles matches, depending on what state they were in.
Yeah.
Mark
exactly,
had not.
Because Mark being underage at the
Mark was
beginning of Ring of Honor.
underage.
For Pennsylvania, Mark being underage.
Yes. So, thinking about this match, all these years later, you look now, the Briscoes are 9-time tag team champions in Ring of Honor. They're still around. They're better than ever. And Jay Briscoe here beats AJ Styles, who is the WWE SmackDown champion. Chris Sabin, who was up until this past weekend, Ring of Honor tag team champion. And Samoa Joe, who hadn't lost the match in nearly 3 months. I don't know if you can really say much about this match other than the fact that it was such a shocking result.
I imagine people were expecting like AJ Styles to win the match, or maybe Sabin.
Mm-hmm.
Not Jay.
No, and it was completely surprising. Of course, nobody at this point was really spoiler-free in terms of when the DVDs would come out, because people would religiously check for results. But the idea that Jay Briscoe was getting this singles title opportunity really led to some very important moments, both for him as a performer and him as a guy that would eventually move up the card.
To now being a 2-time world champion.
Yeah. And still being in Ring of Honor. It's crazy to think that the Briscoes have been in Ring of Honor now since the very first show. So 16 years.
Since day one. That's where that all came from.
They are the OGs, and it's a testament to two guys who value their families, Jay and Mark. Individually, they value their family, and they love the business. When those guys get their own show, there will be some stories that will be told, and maybe the Briscoe outside the ring stuff just needs to be its own show. I don't know, but Jay Briscoe is now your new number 1 contender, and we head into Glory by Honor 2 at the Murphy Rec Center. If I remember correctly, this was the last show at the Murphy Rec.
Yep.
Which had served Ring of Honor very well since the very first show, February 23rd of 2002. Samoa Joe and Christopher Daniels encounter one another one-on-one for the very first time. And there were a lot of fans that thought they were going to see a title change this night.
This crowd was hot. I mean, you figured Daniels had been chasing the belt since the beginning, and this match had basically been built for just shy of a year since Daniels brought Joe in, and they had back and forths and whatever between the Prophecy and the group. And I think people generally thought that, after at this point we're at 6 months for Joe's title reign, that they were going to see the end of it, and Daniels was finally going to get his.
Little did they know, it would be 12, almost 13 years later until Daniels would get his.
Yeah. I almost think it would have been, I don't know, like I said, I don't watch the current product at all, but I kind of thought Daniels would almost always be like the Tommy Dreamer with Ring of Honor, who was always right there and never got it. But I mean, even Dreamer eventually won the world title for 5 seconds.
Yes.
But
and that's pretty much how
Daniels would just be the guy who never won it.
Daniels' run lasted about 5 seconds, so
yeah,
and it went over to Cody Rhodes. But nevertheless, looking back on this match, you were right. The crowd was really hot. The one thing that I took away was, he hits the best moonsault ever and gets a 2 count. And I vividly recall 2 fans, I couldn't tell who they were, standing up and reacting as if they thought it was a 3 count. It was one of those moments in time, and it was very early in the match. It was probably at like the 6 or 7 minute mark of the match that he hit the BME, and people were ready. Like they knew that it's a title change. It's got to happen. And this thing was so hot. There was no slowing down. There was no break. Joe, was hitting Daniels with everything. Daniels was hitting Joe with everything he had. They had so many false finishes.
Even Danger almost got hit with.
Yeah.
I mean, Allison almost got the face wash.
They even did what I think is kind of cruel in hindsight is they even had the bell ring at one point on the false finish. It was when Daniels hit the angel wings and, goes for the cover, gets a 2 2/3, and the bell rings, and they realize, oh my God, that was a 2 count. Daniels tries last rights. Joe reverses it into the clutch. Daniels gets his foot to the ropes. It's crazy that, like, at this point, the crowd is literally on their feet. They're on top of each other in that small little gymnasium. Joe hits an enziguri, and then the island driver for the 3 count right about 15 minutes or so. And it was arguably the most intense of the matches, the most dramatic in terms of the crowd. And I mean, it's incredible the way this match picked up in such a small building.
This is one of those moments with the bell ringing that I wish I was in the company yet, because I watched it, I rewound it and watched it, trying to figure out if that was the fault of whoever was ringing the bell, or if it was the fault of, because if I remember it, Paul was the referee in this, and he never points for the bell. He 1, 2, and he almost counts the 3.
Right.
And like, it's one of those, and which is funny because then he's also the referee for the homicide match down the line in Reborn. So I was one of those moments where I was like, is this? I kind of kept, even now, like, I was watching it back, like, did he accidentally ring the bell? Did the ref call? Paul didn't call for the bell. Did he accidentally ring the bell? Like, what happened there?
I'm convinced it was a called spot for the bell to ring. Because
well, I mean, down the line, in 2004, the same thing happened to me with ringing the bell. I'll tell it story when we get to the match, but that happened to me too as the bell ringer.
And you're told to call it as you see it, and in this case, it looked close enough for me. I had to ring the bell. But what a great match! What a great way to tease the fans in Philly one last time at the Murphy Rec Center with such an epic match. But there's still more to come in the Samoa Joe title run. We're up, we head on to the Baltimore, Glen Burnie, Maryland area at Michael's 8th Avenue. Tradition continues. Jay Briscoe gets his shot at Samoa Joe for the ROH World title. And early in the night, Samoa Joe beat Prince Nana in a singles match before the Jay Briscoe bout. So again, doing double duty. And he beats Jay Briscoe in almost the exact same time, 15 minutes, as the Christopher Daniels match. And there was just something about the two of them that it was like the most natural chemistry between the two. Everything felt right.
And even before Jay got into the take what the Briscoes look like now, with the beards and the hair and the very camo looking gear, and take all that away, and you got kids wrestling in singlets. They're still tatted up, but they're kids wrestling in singlets.
Jay was 19.
But even then, Jay's still hard hitting. He's still giving it. Yeah, he was still. Yeah, that's young. 19 years old. He's a kid, and he'd been doing it for 3, 4, 5 years at this point. I mean, who knows? And you have that monster in Joe, and Jay is giving it as hard as Joe is giving it back. So they work, and as Jay got older and they work more towards that get closer and closer to the cage match, you can see that Jay can go with Joe. He's not just a tag team guy, and even he can hang in there with the world champion. And it goes to show you get a series. You wouldn't think Jay would get a series of matches with Joe, but you get a series of matches that come out of this.
Both tags and singles, and marks included too down the line. I mean, this match did so much for Jay Briscoe, and again, it reflects on how selfless Samoa Joe was as champion, where he's willing to kind of give of himself to make everybody else he's in the ring with look better.
One thing that was kind of cool to me to look up in just kind of research mode was finding that before this, that of all people for Joe to defend the belt against, he defended it against Aries, not Austin Aries, but Aries, who was Claudio's tag team partner in Swiss Money Holding, who is now married to Allison Danger. That Joe, in one of his international title defenses in Germany, defended the belt against him. It's just further showing that the Ring of Honor name had value beyond just the Philadelphia, Jersey, New York, the area. Mm-hmm. It was growing, and I think that shows that having the Ring of Honor brand on your show carried some weight if it was being defended on a show in Germany.
Which is insane to think about, that an independent promotion that started out in this tiny gymnasium in a dirty section of Philly would branch out to this point. It's incredible to think like Ring of Honor now has this brand, this brand name to it. So we really do establish the Samoa Joe, Jay Briscoe war of attrition here. They really, beat the hell out of each other. Joe wins. He hits the island driver. Jay kicks out. Joe throws some more blows, and he wins it with a lariat, which I thought was kind of an odd finish. But it was great that he finished with that because he didn't use like his go-to moves to beat Jay Briscoe. It added credibility to Jay that he had to beat him with something he never used.
It established another finisher. In the same way we talked about Bryan having multiple finishers by the end of his title run. It established the Island Driver. It established the Muscle Buster was established. The Choke was established. And now he's got this Lariat, which we'll see him use again down the line in other matches as a finish for the match. It's Joe's having to grow, I think, as the world champion because he's facing new people and they're starting to, you would think about that. It's almost like to take wrestling out of its predetermined worked context and try to look at it as if it was 100% shoot. People are going to study your tapes, see what you do, and they'll figure out how to work against that. They'll figure out how to defend it, figure out how to counter you. So you have to come up with new shit.
It's incredible too because that lariat or the short arm clothesline, whatever you want to call it, I still don't know the difference between the two moves. It was impactful, but it wasn't established. So I think it kind of shocked that crowd back into being ready, I guess, for a match to end.
Yeah.
the same way, you know, if you had seen Christopher Daniels finish a match with a German suplex or something like that, like it was, you know, it was out of nowhere, and it really like we said, you know, Jay Briscoe had done some singles matches. He had done he did the very first singles match in company history with the Amazing Red at the Era of Honor Begins, but he had never had a featured title match. And I really think, looking back all the way to 2003, I think not only did Gabe see something in him, but I think what Gabe saw in him led to where he was headed. And it literally was the beginning of the Jay Briscoe rise. We head next into Homicide and Samoa Joe at Empire State Showdown, and they are at and this always cracked me up. It's the Salmon Creek Country Club in Spencerport, New York. You don't. I'm reading that and I'm just thinking, like, this does not sound like a Ring of Honor venue.
All I know of this building, and this is from Rich as he was doing hard camera, from Wayne and Mary, from Jimmy, is that you can literally hear golf balls pinging off the roof of this building as the show is going on. You know, figure Rich doing the hard camera was the closest one to that roof, and he's like, I fucking hear golf balls like pinging off the roof. Like, hopefully Wayne and Mary have listened to this, and then they'll have some great they had some great stories about this building that they would tell, and just how like ridiculous it was being on a golf course essentially for a wrestling show.
And if you think about it, like, okay, independent wrestling, like, you think of fairgrounds, you think of National Guard armories, you don't think of country clubs. So what do you think, like, when Homicide rolled up to the Salmon Creek Country Club with Loke and DeVito, like, in their car? Like, what do you think some of those country club goers thought?
Yo, what the fuck is this, yo? We playing golf tonight? We get a hole in one, par 4. Like, I can't even imagine what D would be thinking of that, or Loke and DeVito, or just like some of the buildings that we were at. I mean, hell, we ran a country club. We ran in a glorified horse show venue in Montreal. We ran armories. We ran in fields covered in mud and under tents, and
the one thing, like, this no holds barred match, you know, Homicide actually gets a win over Samoa Joe, and you think about, like, okay, Joe is this dominant champion, but Homicide has now beaten him 2 times in their 3 matches.
And violently so in this one.
Yeah, I mean, they beat the hell out of each other. Not only that, but you have this whole, like, gang mentality almost, because Smokes is with Homicide now, and Joe has no allies. So Joe is kind of sequestered in his own little bubble. But aside from this match, and without delving into details because it's not a title match, the only other thing from this show that I really, in great detail, remember is the Carino Punk time limit draw. And as we usually do on this show, we will find time to shout out Bobby Cruz, because this was Bobby Cruz's first time on a Ring of Honor show with Steve Carino. And the theme of this whole shout out to Bobby Cruz is he had a list that he would read for Steve Carino's intro, and it was of wrestlers with drug and alcohol problems. So CM Punk got the old ring announcer, Stephen DeAngelis, recruited him to read a list of his own of drugs that CM Punk will not do. And I cannot tell you a moment up in Ring of Honor history at this point that I laughed as hard as I did at this 20-minute draw. Because the lists that those two guys do and how young Bobby Cruz looked. I went back and watched this DVD. I watched the Punk Carino segment, and then I watched Homicide and Smokes just abuse Samoa Joe for 14 minutes. But looking at how young Bobby Cruz looked as he was reading this list, and the whole presentation that, you know, he had his own ring announcer Brian Regal, who would announce Bobby Cruz, and then Bobby Cruz would read this list, and then do the whole Steve Corino, the fucking god of professional wrestling. And then Punk reads off his list, you know, gets the list read off of drugs that he will not do. And years later, now that I'm kind of in the position I'm in, I'm like, oh, wow. These are a lot of opiates that people are abusing to this day, especially here where I live. It's a huge problem.
Same here.
And
as a fan, a lifelong fan of the heels in wrestling, as far back as I can remember, this match when I finally got to watch it, because I think at this point our VHS tape delays were ridiculous. I was definitely working for the company by the time this VHS saw the light of day, and I finally got to watch it. I was absolutely in love with this entire segment, and the ending of you look him in the eyes and say "fuck you." How they wrap up the entire promo, the entire segment with Steve and Punk was just money to me. I loved it. I loved every second of it.
If you look at just those two matches, the Homicide and Joe, and then Punk Carino, those are headline matches.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved the way that they finished off the main event. You clearly can see that, you know, Homicide and Joe aren't interacting on every single solitary show at this point. You know, they're kind of staying away from each other for a little bit, then they're getting back into it for a little bit, then they go away from each other for a while, then they come back to it again, and you really see this rivalry. Now we've reached the no holds barred match, so that's the next stage of their violent feud.
And I think the biggest takeaway from this is the first time Joe looked vulnerable.
That's a great way to put it.
He lost to Moth in a flash pin. He did not get pinned in the four-way that Jay Briscoe won. Somebody else did.
Sabin.
This is the first time Joe has looked vulnerable as the champion, I think. He got beat, and he got choked out by a noose. He was a beaten man. And now Homicide has another claim to why he deserves a shot at Joe for the belt.
And it's really just one of those matches that you see the tone set for a feud, and we had already thought it had maxed out, and boy, were we wrong. We move next to Main Event Spectacles. It's Elizabeth, New Jersey. It is the 1st of November, 2003. And Samoa Joe is in a four-corner survival match that is non-title against CM Punk, Steve Corino, and Christopher Daniels. Corino and Punk would pin Christopher Daniels with a double pin. It was actually a pretty fun match, all things considered. Awkward finish. Nothing really consequential here. The finish was kind of confusing to me. Maybe Corino had some sort of Japanese title or the NWA title and couldn't do a job. Obviously, you're not pinning your champion in Joe, and maybe this was used as a way to kind of play off Empire State Showdown with the Punk and Corino story, as well as, you know, maybe give Punk a little bit of a boost up, while Daniels was your most vulnerable guy. This show had a lot less to do with Samoa Joe's match as opposed to what happened off camera with Samoa Joe that night in Elizabeth. But Shane, this was also the day that you started your journey toward Ring of Honor. Talk about what it was like driving out to Philly with your dad and how you felt.
Yeah, I woke up November 1st and finished packing up after a very lengthy night of multiple goodbye/Halloween parties, and got on the road to drive out to Langhorne with my dad, period. With no place to live, with no idea what I was doing. We just got out here and just started searching once we got here. Stayed in a hotel for a couple nights. I think I moved into my first apartment in Germantown area on the 3rd, thinking we were going to start training on the 4th or 5th. But Punk had a hurt knee, I believe it was, and we pushed our training start date back until the Monday before Thanksgiving. So it would have been Monday, the week of the conclusion and War of the Wire. That would end up being our actual start date.
So it was a pretty big time in both Samoa Joe's locker room presence and the beginning of your journey in wrestling. We talk about Samoa Joe's off-camera activities this night in Elizabeth, and earlier on the show there was a match, the Scramble Cage, tag team Scramble Cage match featuring the Backseat Boys of Johnny Cashmere and the late Trent Acid, Special K of Angel Dust and Hydro, who was Jay Lethal, the Carnage crew of DeVito and Loke, the quote-unquote Next Generation Hart Foundation of Jack Evans and Teddy Hart, and the Spanish announce team of Joel and Jose Maximo, the SATs. This match in particular, a lot of high-flying stuff, but the behavior of Teddy Hart in this match, going into business for himself, this was really the first major example, I guess you could say, of Teddy's behavior going off the rails, becoming unreliable, him, quote, not remembering doing things. And it got physical with Samoa Joe, and it got physical with CM Punk and Teddy and Jack as well. Jack standing up for his friend. Jack was new in the locker room. Teddy, trying to make a first impression, did not make a positive one. And I guess, over the years, what have you heard about that night that, relates to the brawl? Because that's essentially what I've always heard, was that there was a legitimate brawl between Punk and Teddy, and Samoa Joe just basically cleaned house, including putting Jack in a chokehold. And that's something Jack Evans has personally told me.
What I had heard about it was essentially that Teddy claimed he was knocked out on his feet and had no recollection of what he was doing, and that when he got to the back, Joe was basically waiting for him, and so was Punk, and other members of the locker room just absolutely livid that he went into business for himself and put others at risk, and really put his own self at risk, because if you go up to the top of the cage and start doing moonsaults without anybody knowing you're doing it, if these people aren't there to catch you, you're just gonna land or see what happens, I guess. So
Well, and
really just kind of it's not even like calling it on the fly in a match. The match is over. This is just your showboating and getting your shit in, and just not really caring about anyone else but yourself. And so when he got to the back, I know his bags got tossed out the building, and I know never knew the extent of the physical altercation that night, but he was not seen again for 6 years in Ring of Honor until Final Battle 2009.
No, Teddy was back at our best.
Was he?
Yeah, in the 6-way.
Oh, that's right. Forgot he was in the 6-way. I totally forgot he was in the 6-way.
Yeah, he's in the 6-way, which, coincidentally is one of the shows up for debate on our upcoming poll, which we'll talk about later. Yeah, he was in the 6-way at our best. But Jack was back fairly regularly, and I think we all realized that Jack was not necessarily the instigator that was the problem in this situation. It was Teddy and Teddy's bipolar behavior, and I've gotten to know Teddy a little bit over the last couple of years, and I still don't think he's grown up, and that's all I'll say on Teddy. Nice, very nice in person, generous, but I think there's still some lingering issues that he needs to take care of and make wrestling less of a priority, and I wish him nothing but the best. After this night, we head on to the conclusion. This was the conclusion weekend. This was one half of a double shot. The first night, the conclusion took place at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut, and was the start of basically Samoa Joe's quest to become a double champion. He gets a tag team title shot this night against the Briscoes, where he teams with AJ Styles. They go 15-52, and the Briscoes get the win. The next night is War of the Wire, and they are in the Framingham State College in Framingham, Massachusetts. It's November 29th, 2003. Joe defeats AJ in a 16-minute, 45-second match. Pretty minor on the scale of major Joe title defenses. It was a great match. One of the better title matches that he had. You could see that those two had incredible chemistry, but it didn't really have much of a story behind it other than they just went out and had a great match.
Yeah, it was just basically AJ clothesline Joe the night before to cost him the belt, and wasn't it AJ winning the match against Bryan at Main Event Spectacles?
Yes, that got him this title shot. Yep.
Yeah, it was a hell of a match. It was a preview of the kind of stuff we would see out of them in TNA.
Yeah, and I kind of have a feeling that, as they're both off at WWE, those two guys, when they get in the ring together, that's going to be a hell of a match, 15 years later. I think that they'll kind of go in there with something to prove. And they're really good friends off camera, so I think that always helps when you have a match to put together. But the one thing I wanted to address with Joe and AJ here, you kind of had two guys that were legitimate pillars of their own individual companies. AJ was a pretty much the most popular and pushed guy at TNA at this point. Joe was the centerpiece and champion at Ring of Honor. And was there a legitimate rivalry between the two companies? Was it something that the Ring of Honor office kind of had? They had heat with TNA. TNA had heat with ROH. Was it a jealousy thing on either side?
I mean, at this point, like literally, this was my first weekend on the road. I'd been training for a week, so I was oblivious to absolutely anything except sit down, shut up, and listen. Do what you needed to do. But as we went forward, it was an interesting relationship I always saw with TNA, because you can look at all of the cards, the match results, and everything over the years, and you can see that we had at points a pretty healthy relationship with TNA. as far as using talent between the two companies. And then there was also the times where they would just decide randomly, oh yeah, our guys can't work for you anymore, and we end up with shows like Unscripted 2. It was a very, I guess, tenuous relationship would be the best way to describe it.
And it always felt like ROH was not the guilty party in terms of pulling guys or changing things around. It always felt like it was TNA being the troublemakers.
Well, TNA, and always, a lot of the times I felt it was Bill Behrens was the messenger because he was the guy who handled a lot of people's bookings.
Yep.
A lot of AJ and
Daniels.
Delirious, I believe at one point, Daniels.
Sabin.
He handled a lot of those guys' bookings, so I think he was often the messenger of what was going to happen as well. I think we tried to use it to our benefit as well, because I think there were certain markets where the TNA guys on top drew.
Long Island.
And others, Long Island in particular. I think you can look at a lot of the cards in Long Island and you'll see the TNA faces on top. The Daniels, the Joe, the AJ.
Which is super ironic because TNA never ran or runs on Long Island ever.
Yeah. But maybe that was the draw because they didn't get to see these people live except on TV. So it was a tenuous, occasionally combative relationship. Was my perspective on our dealings with TNA most of the time.
Well, we head on to Final Battle 2003, where there were no TNA issues, but we had the Great Muta making an appearance at Final Battle 2003, and he is in some pretty important matches, along with some other All Japan talent. Satoshi Kojima and Homicide took place that night. Arashi and the Great Muta defeated Christopher Daniels and Dan Moff. Kaz Hayashi and AJ Styles did battle. Tomoaki Honma and Kazushi Miyamoto wrestled CM Punk and Colt Cabana. And in the middle of the show, right after the snooze fest of a final to the Field of Honor with Matt Striker defeating BJ Whitmer, Samoa Joe defeats Mark Briscoe in an ROH World Title match. So Samoa Joe has now defeated both Briscoes in singles title matches. This match I always remember from the DVD as being very good, but it wasn't one of Joe's great title defenses. You could kind of see that Mark was not necessarily a full step behind Jay as a singles performer, but there was a noticeable difference. And I felt like you could see that in this match. This match was built very similarly to the Jay Briscoe match back in Glen Burnie in Maryland at Tradition Continues, but it kind of had a little more edge to it because the Joe versus Briscoe's feud had just picked up a little bit. So interesting match, and it wraps up 2003 Samoa Joe.
Yeah, I sat ringside for that match. And I even remember, like, if you're facing hard camera, I was kind of, like, hard camera looking at the ring, I was kind of in the right-hand corner of your TV screen for the match, and I remember being really impressed with it because, yeah, for the most part, I think I'd only seen Mark Briscoe in tag matches almost all of his Ring of Honor matches aside from the ones he had against Jay, and I was pretty impressed with how he hung with the champ. And I believe one of those matches that me and Jimmy Fetterman were both pretty high on when it happened. It just really showed that both Briscoes could go in singles competitions, but Jay was a step beyond Mark at that point, definitely.
So that wraps up 2003 Samoa Joe. the year he became Ring of Honor champion, all the way up from his debut. And I think you could see that throughout the course of the year, this character, the Samoa Joe aura, really began to grow both on camera and in the locker room as a locker room leader, as a teachable guy. He was the soul of the locker room, much as The Undertaker was at WWE. And we begin 2004 with a joint show between sometimes bitter off-camera rivals, Jersey All Pro Wrestling and Ring of Honor, at Collision Course. This took place at the Woodbridge Armory, New Jersey, Woodbridge, New Jersey. And Samoa Joe would defeat Balls Mahoney for the Ring of Honor World title, defending his belt to start off the year. Not much to say about this one.
It was just, I wasn't there for this show because I was en route for the show the next night in Ohio. But it's just an interesting show to look at in terms of the card. I remember it being like, trying to remember off the top of my head without going and looking at the
I've
the
already got it right in front of me. We've got a four-corner
There's an interesting match involving Punk on that show, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. CM Punk, AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, and the fourth man who does not fit this equation, John Walters, in a
That's right.
25-minute four-corner survival match that Christopher Daniels ended up winning. Other luminaries on this show included Shane Douglas defeating Justin Credible. You had kind of a interesting scramble match, six-man tag, Azrael, Jay Lethal, and the Insane Dragon versus Special K, quote-unquote, of Deranged, Dixie, and Lit. The ironic thing here is that all six guys in this match were part of Special K in Ring of Honor. Insane Dragon was Izzy, Azrael was Azrael, and Jay Lethal was Hydro.
Azrael was Angel Dust.
Angel Dust, yes, and then became Azrael later on. You also had what they call an Incredible Partners tag match where DeVito and Trent Acid teamed up to take on Johnny Kashmere and Loke.
That's right.
I don't know what sort of theory was behind that match, but that has nothing to do with Samoa Joe, so we'll just chalk it up to
show that will never ever come up again. It was one of those shows that because of the time frame and who filmed it and et cetera, it fell through the cracks and was not a show that Ring of Honor owned once
everything happened here in the upcoming months.
Was no longer involved with it, and it became Kerry's company.
Yes.
The When Worlds Collide show, or whatever it was called, is just that's
Collision Course.
Somebody that exists elsewhere, but not with Ring of Honor.
Nope. I've got a copy though, in my archives. So the next night, we are in Wilmington, Ohio, which is not Dayton, Ohio. So, Jim Cornette, for your own future edification when you listen to this show, Wilmington and Dayton are two different places. I know you're old and outdated, but had you used Google Maps or GPS, you would have gone to the right building. On this very night, the Briscoes defend the ROH Tag Team titles against Bryan Danielson and Samoa Joe. Yet another tag team partner in Joe's quest to become a double champion and failing. This was arguably the best of the Joe tag team title matches, I think. I don't remember watching this much more than I would, anything I've watched recently, but it was a great example of what the Briscoes would go on to do as a tag team, where they managed to hit all these double moves, and Joe and Danielson didn't know how to counteract those moves because they're single stars. But it was a great match, and it was a great way to start the quote-unquote traditional Ring of Honor year at the battle lines are drawn.
And I think it also served to build a Brian and Joe story as well.
Mm-hmm.
The rivalry between them that you would see a little bit of danced around on like the Reborn shows with the Samoa Joe's ring segment, and then before they finally got to an actual match later in 2004. This was another interesting show in terms of location because we were sharing the building with a gun show that day.
The first time in Ring of Honor history that happened. That happened 2 other times? Yeah, 2 other times.
Yeah.
If I remember off the top of my head. 2 times at least I was in the building where I was like, wow, look at those rednecks and those guns. That's... I'm just going to, put my hoodie up and I'm going to go somewhere else. Those people scared me just a scotch. But
wow. I just remembered other stuff about this show that is not fit for public consumption, but
okay. Well,
you'll have to think about it.
I will be texting you later about that story, probably during tonight's basketball game. So moving on, we go to the Last Stand, appropriately titled enough at Michael's 8th Avenue in Glen Burnie, Maryland. The Briscoes are defending the tag team titles again against Samoa Joe, but this time his partner is Jerry Lynn, and they would go on to defeat Jerry Lynn and Samoa Joe again. This would be the end of the Samoa Joe tag team title venture, at least during this portion of his career. Not as good as the AJ match, AJ and Joe match. Not as good as the Brian and Joe match.
A very weak finish, unfortunately.
Yes.
Because take a look at who the timekeeper is, the bell ringer. And the bell I was pointed at by, was it Gary Moyer, I believe was the ref in this match?
Yeah, Ref Gary.
And he signaled at me to ring the bell when it wasn't the finish, and I was terrified of getting in trouble for it. And Doug was the one who calmed me down and was like, "Did Gary point at you?" "Yes." "Don't worry about it. It's not your fault. The ref called for you to ring the bell. You rang the bell. It's not your fault." And I was just like paranoid and freaked out that I was gonna get in trouble, and I don't know what would have been done to me, but I was just completely paranoid that I screwed up and ruined the entire show. When really what ruined the entire match was the old man's weak ass racket shot that Joe was forced to sell, and then you watch the referee get take a cradle pile driver.
And you'll notice that throughout the last portion, I failed to mention that the old man was managing the Briscoes at this point, and I did that on purpose because I didn't want to give the old man any more attention than he probably would want. So we move on to Braintree, Massachusetts. It is the 2nd anniversary show at the National Guard Armory. This show is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, this show hosted the very first Ring of Honor fan gathering, led by the legendary Greg H. So this show was kind of the precipice for Ring of Honor kind of being the people's wrestling promotion. Greg H. Organized a fan gathering at a local restaurant before the show, hosted some wrestlers after the show, and this was really the beginning of a very special relationship between wrestlers and certain fans. And I think all these years later, these are still going on. I know it's always a special occasion, and if you're looking for somebody who should be sainted, Greg H. Is definitely that guy. He is the man So
where the hell did you find a place to eat in this hellhole of a town?
I think we were in in Boston.
Okay.
Is
So
where
there's
the
nothing
fan
anywhere.
gathering was probably
There was
in
nothing
Boston. I don't know the specific location. I wasn't there, but yeah, this is the very first fan gathering show, second anniversary. Amazing that all these years later I remember that. But yeah, I don't know where they went, where they ate, but I should ask Greg because that should be documented historically. But we have a 4-corner survival match for the Ring of Honor World Title this night. And this is the first time since Glory by Honor that Samoa Joe and Low Ki are going to get their hands on each other in a non-tag match. You've also got BJ Whitmer and Danny Moff in the match. Moff is, of course, associated with Low Ki. They come from the same training school. Whitmer and Moff, both part of the Prophecy. The Prophecy have issues with Low Ki in terms of following the Code of Honor. Samoa Joe obviously has issues with everybody. He is the champion, so he's hunted by everyone. And these 4 guys beat the fuck out of each other. That was my takeaway from the match.
Well, it certainly helped that it was, what do we say, Low Ki's first time back in 6 months?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, because the last match he was at was the one where he knocked out Moff, that Bitter Friends, Stiff Enemies match. So that was the other story into this. It was just, yeah, oh my God, just everybody in this match just took it to each other as stiffly and as snugly as Joe and Ki did way back in at the first Glory by Honor.
It was almost like the fans were so anticipatory of Joe and Ki getting their hands on each other that Whitmer and Moff were kind of the backstory. But really, I thought BJ in particular was kind of the star of this match. You know, he's the one that taps out at the finish to Joe about the 23-minute mark. But BJ took some incredible beatings from everyone and sold it like a champ. Whereas Joe was doing his normal selling. Moff, you know, took some shots, but he wasn't necessarily like the most adept at, you know, kind of playing off of everyone. And Low Ki just got his shit in. I liked this match a lot, but it got me thinking, and I've kind of mentioned this to you before. Do you think Low Ki was kind of overrated a little bit in terms of his run and overall like value to the company?
Yes.
I mean, like, his attitude sucked. Like, he took his character from, you know, inside the ring. It extended to outside of the ring, which was kind of unnecessary, especially at the independent wrestling level. It just didn't. Listen, I love Low Ki matches to this day. They still hold up for the most part, but it just, I don't know if they would have been better served putting the belt on a mega heel first to start than giving it to Ki and then having him job to Xavier and then finding a way to put the belt on Joe.
I don't know if, and as I'm sitting here thinking about it, I don't know if overrated is the best word.
Overvalued?
Overvalued me? I don't know, because I figured it was crucial. He was a crucial part of those first six shows. The opening 3-way, the the match with Bryan, round robin match with Ki, with Daniels, the road to the title matches, the actual title match, the AJ title defense. Like, he was a crucial part of the most important matches that set the foundation for the company. But after those 6 matches and then the match with Joe, his importance dwindles. You know, it's almost like he had a hot run and then just kind of a special attraction to drift in and out here and there.
And that's what he did.
Yeah,
he was in and out
even this match,
a lot.
This match, he was a last-minute addition to. This match was a three-way to begin with because of some weird double pin thing with Moff and Whitmer. So he got added to this match because he was available, and I remember the advance for the house not being that great. Probably in part because it was in fucking Braintree, Massachusetts. And it was maybe hard because it was two guys Joe had already beaten, so a three-way maybe wasn't the biggest draw as it. And the pure title finals, I guess, which was the other big thing on this show, wasn't a huge draw. But again, it's fucking Braintree, Massachusetts. So he was somebody, I guess, who could attract the fans to come in, but after that first 6 months or so, I don't think he was greatly important to the company.
And that's really unfortunate because a guy with that style would have been a huge addition. But we wrap up the second anniversary, and we actually head in an unexpected direction. We head to GSW Germany, Fatal Friday 2, March 5th, 2004. Samoa Joe would take the Ring of Honor World title to Germany, and he would defend the title successfully against Ahmed Shire, Chaer. I'm pretty familiar with a lot of indie wrestling all over the world. I've never heard of this guy ever, but he got a Ring of Honor World title shot, so he's got that going for him. And he lost to Samoa Joe. Thoughts?
Cool to look at the title history and see that Joe was defending the belt repeatedly outside of the company, and they were acknowledged title defenses. It wasn't just like went to some place and defended the belt, but it was never recognized by the company. It was just used to pop a house. No, these were the Ring of Honor World title was protected in that sense of it wasn't just a title that people would go to an indie and defend it. They were sanctioned matches. The champion was protected in that sense. It was treated with every bit as respect as if we were, as if it was the WWE World Champion going and defending the belt somewhere else.
Well, from there we head to arguably the weirdest period of time in Ring of Honor history. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to say arguably. It was definitely the weirdest period of time in Ring of Honor history. Scandal hit the company. Owner of the company at the time was Rob Feinstein. He was caught chatting online with an underage turned out to be an undercover. Samoa Joe, as champion, said if Rob was kept around, he was taking the belt and melting it down to a 5-wood. That became a running joke later on because I used to say nobody uses 5-woods anymore out on the golf course. A lot of people refused to work with Ring of Honor going forward. TNA talent were pulled. There was basically this massive backlash against, Ring of Honor's owner getting caught, trying to be a pedophile. You were around around this time. We're going to eventually do a show essentially at our best centric, but just give me some brief thoughts on that whole thing. And your reaction to everything.
I guess this would be one of those moments where I'd say, well, if you want to hear detailed conversation, you can vote for it on the poll that we put up at the end of the Hero episode that I initially set up to run for a week, but I'll probably extend it to just Twitter will only let you run the poll for 1 week at a time, no more than that.
I put that on a T, by the way, in terms of plugging the poll. I put that on a T in terms of plugging the poll.
Yeah. Suffice to say, I was in shock, surprised, concerned I would not even have a job anymore. Because at this point I was 1 month into actually working for the company in the office, much less training. So it was a very stressful time in all aspects of my life. So it was strangely not refreshing, I guess, surprising and hopeful to see the kind of turnout that this event had in a show of support for the company, I guess, because there were a lot of people here. It was our very first time running the same weekend as WrestleMania. I'd like to think that Ring of Honor started that trend that everyone else pretty much copies now. And in particular with this steel cage match between Joe and Jay that had been built up to for the last 5 months and really elevated Jay up to the next level and set the tone for where the company would go from here.
This match in particular, I would say, did a better job at elevating one single guy more than any other match in the 2 years Ring of Honor had been around at this point. Jay Briscoe took moves in this match from Joe that are moments captured in time that all these years later you still see in highlight packages. You look back, you watch the match, you remember your first time seeing that muscle buster off the top of the ropes, the blade job from Jay, all these the just ginormous Yakuza kick when Joe finally goes down. There was, you have Mark at ringside and rooting on Joe. All these, the door slam, the cage. Every little thing in this match was, it all built to this amazing crescendo of Joe finally putting him away. And that's all I got. I mean, the match just blew me away.
My memory, like the first thing that I think of when I think of this match is Jimmy at ringside getting blood on himself from Jay's ridiculous amount of blood that came out. I mean, his blood was clotting. You could watch it. Go back and watch the tape. The blood is clotting on him. There's so much of it, and it's disgusting to watch. It's so gross, and it's up there as one of the grossest, blood jobs I've ever seen in wrestling. Period. Like across the board, any company, any matches I can think of. I can't think of too many matches that hit a higher level on the Muda scale than this one.
And Jay Briscoe's a hell of a bleeder.
Yeah.
So this was kind of the start of that, where I think over the years people knew that, like, okay, if we have a match where we need blood, let's just call Jay Briscoe, have him come on down and, slice up his forehead a little bit. And he looks like a clean, like, young baby face. He's 20 years old roughly at this point, and his level of experience is, almost 5 years at this point in the business, and he's headlining a show in front of, more people than Ring of Honor had ever had attend a single show. There was 1,800 people in attendance. I mean, that's insane compared to what we had seen previously. I mean, even even if you compare that 1,800 number, and it's WrestleMania weekend, WrestleMania 20, I think was the WrestleMania that year. But if you go back and you compare it to even main event spectacles in November, that's 1,000 more people in the building. Main event spectacles is 800 people. It's an incredible number to jump, and it was a big spot for Ring of Honor to have this match in addition to everything else that happened on the show. But it allowed Ring of Honor to basically, establish that, okay, WrestleMania weekend, we're going to be doing our show and our style of wrestling where the big guys are doing it, and we're going to put on a better show. And
I think Ring of Honor did almost every year. Almost.
Keyword being almost. Hashtag ROH Phoenix. Vote on it in the poll if you want to make me watch those two shows. For the first time ever. I've never seen them. I have them still in shrink wrap. So,
I think the other thing to take out of the show is I think it's also the beginning of you see a shift in Joe as champion and the story of Joe as champion. This is when you start to see what you got a little taste of in that Homicide Empire State Showdown match. This is the beginning of Joe as the vulnerable champion. You see the whole idea that being worn down, just all of these high impact, hard hitting, violent matches are starting to take a toll on him as the champion. I think become the story as we go into the reborn stage of Ring of Honor's story. We're heading into this new era. There's no other way to call it, under a new ownership, new direction, and trying to distance ourselves from all of that bullshit. And Joe is the face of the company. It becomes Punk and Joe, but Joe is the face of the company, taking us out of all of that scandal. And that, at our best match, puts him up on that pedestal in front of a larger audience than had ever watched Ring of Honor before, to the best of what I can remember.
Yeah, it was the biggest crowd in company history at that point.
And it also marks a new direction for him as champ.
And that's a great way to transcend into Reborn Stage 1. Took place April 23rd, 2004 at the St. Paul Armory in St. Paul, Minnesota. Samoa Joe and Homicide once again locked horns for the Ring of Honor World title. And this match in particular seemed like, between the odd ring, the odd crowd atmosphere, the fact that this was the first time Ring of Honor had ever gone to the Midwest, at least this far into the Midwest, it just felt different. Everything felt unique. It was almost as if nothing in the Homicide Samoa Joe rivalry had kind of clicked with this crowd. So they're seeing all these crazy moves and like lariats and the tope suicida and all these things for the first time. So they're reacting to it like, holy shit, we're seeing this thing for the first time. It's amazing. The other thing in this match is Homicide, essentially, with the result of the finish of the match, Homicide's got a crew. He's got a gang behind him. Not just Julius Smokes, but he's got a gang behind him. And what element did you think, they were adding with that, with building up Homicide even further and expanding his character?
Well, I thought there was always that idea, that there was always the idea of like the Rottweilers was always like an idea, and like an almost amorphous idea in Homicide's story, and it was more like the Sea Negros and the people that came from like the doghouse guys
Mm-hmm.
were kind of like his unofficial crew who would kind of people that were involved in the riot and things like that. But coming out of this show, the whole concept of the Rottweilers begins to form as an actual faction of people who are going to be on the shows and in the ring. And it's, I mean, this show you get your tease with the Ring of Honor who turned out the lights moment, and then as you see it build into when you the pit bulls and Smokes, and then the eventual return of Low Key a couple months later, how the Rottweilers actually becomes a faction and a group, and it builds up Homicide from. I think Gabe would always, takes him back to his roots in the street, and Gabe and commentary would often talk about, he's, especially in the early shows when Homicide went singles, about him trying to, be better for his kid and, not stay away from that gang life. And then this was almost Homicide saying, "Fuck it, that way's not working for me. Then I'm just going back to what I know." And he's the guy who. This is definitely, if there's a showcase feud for Samoa Joe, it's this, and it's really this portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
They had the earlier matches, but this, Reborn Stage 1 through Death Before Dishonor 2 Part 1 in Wauwatosa, that those 3 matches right there are the ones that I think those are the matches you think of when you think of this as a feud, because it becomes bloody and violent and brutal and stiff and weapons, and the end of this match with the fireball in Joe's face. This is the match that continues the story of Joe as a vulnerable champion going forward for the remainder of his run, as being worn down by all battles, and it elevates Homicide into from the MVP 2003, as he was kind of referred to in commentary and on the comp DVD we made back then, to more of almost like a straight up brawling, violent bunkhouse fighter. And everything about the way he carried himself, I just feel like, it's you're seeing a bit of a different Homicide.
Yeah, this truly was a kind of a sharp right turn for the Homicide character. They go about 19 minutes, and at one point the lights go out in the building. This was, smaller venue, but the fact that Ring of Honor was able to get the lights turned out in the entire building all at one time, I thought was pretty awesome. Because it doesn't seem like a one switch, everything goes out. So the lights go out, and a fireball is thrown into Samoa Joe's face, dipping into Homicide's love of Memphis wrestling. He throws the fireball into Joe's face, the bell rings, Paul Turner is checking on Samoa Joe. You see Homicide basically selling the fact that, he's had it. He's ready for war. The look on his face, he punches Paul Turner. He is so frustrated that he can't beat Joe for this belt. And it's not even the belt. It's just he wants to beat Joe. They turn the lights out, and now we have a whole new facet to this rivalry. In that Homicide has now thrown fire at Samoa Joe, and this is now a new market that they're displaying this violence after a strong style match. We move into the very next night, Reborn Stage 2. Samoa Joe beats Matt Striker in about 19 minutes. There's nothing to say about this match. He beats him, I would assume, via the choke. I didn't go back and watch any matches featuring Matt Striker, so there's no reason for me to.
Real quick before we go too far, one of the things that was cool about this time frame on the DVDs, and not so much for the live card, is Gabe was using the Samoa Joe's ring segments. I know I mentioned it already, but the Reborn Stage 1 DVD has a Samoa Joe's ring segment with him and Brian, like trying to show who has the better moves, and Brian choked the living shit out of me with a grommet on that one. And then they followed up the next night on the DVD with, after the Fireball, Joe's not there. Where's Joe? He's not building yet. Nobody knew the condition of if he was burnt or not coming out of it. So there was a storytelling element on the DVDs that also kind of further enhanced the weakening of Joe and the Joe and Brian story that culminated later. It was a nice bit of storytelling that you tend to not think of Ring of Honor as being a storytelling promotion, especially back in this time frame. But even the Reborn match itself, we talked about the Paul Turner false ringing the bell at Glory of Honor 2 in the Daniels match. That's exactly what happens in the Reborn Stage 1 match, but this time Paul gets the shit beat out of him by Homicide for it, and that's what turns Homicide. Yet again, Homicide's got another legit claim that he should be the champ, and he beat Joe, and that was a callback to that earlier match with the exact same referee and the exact same sort of spot. So I think you find a lot of storytelling, especially in Joe's run and with Joe, that you don't tend to think of with Ring of Honor.
And that was, an important element to the Homicide Joe feud and rivalry portions of their interactions. I mean, those two guys are two polar opposite characters, but at the same time, they are very similar in terms of how their characters translated to the crowd. The crowd could connect to each guy in a unique way, and they were very organic. Everything was just created out of air. There was no forced. You looked at Homicide, and it wasn't that he was a rich guy. That would have been shoved down your throat. He looked the part. He acted the part. Joe was a badass. He looked the part. He acted the part. Homicide's a street guy. Looks the part. Acts the part. There you go. That's it. It's simple. There's no overthinking. But as we said, Stryker would go down to Samoa Joe in 20 minutes. Why that got so much time, I have no idea. Maybe Joe was still traumatically damaged mentally from the night before. Either that or he was so bored wrestling Matt Stryker that he lost track of time. We fast forward to May 15, 2004, Round Robin Challenge 3. And this is in yet another building in the Boston area, Lexington, Massachusetts, the National Guard Armory. And Round Robin Challenge 3 is the name of the show. And there were approximately 875 tag team title changes this night. But Samoa Joe found out who the man was that turned out the lights. And it was Ricky Reyes, a.k.a. Rick Noon. Ricky Reyes, one half of the Havana Pitbulls with Rocky Romero, and they are now managed by Julius Smokes and associated with Homicide and the Rottweilers. And Reyes is the man that turned out the lights so that the fireball could be thrown, and Joe disposes of him in 9 minutes and 43 seconds. Non-title match, of course. And there's not much to say really about the Ricky Reyes match, aside from the fact that Joe exacted his revenge. Joe got his payback on the man that caused his face to be burnt. Any other thoughts from the night of 1,075 tag team title changes?
I had lunch with Roddy that day. Picked him up at the airport.
I'm sure that was a treat.
It was actually.
Old.
It was pleasant. It was pleasant to talk to Roddy.
I kid, Roddy. Please don't hurt me the next time I see you. Please. Thank you.
And I mean that was it was the match was what it was. It was more just like a storytelling point of getting revenge on the Rockweilers.
The Rockweilers. Yo, Rick Reyes is the one that turned out the lights. Yeah. Both of us are working on our Homicide impressions for the Homicide episode that will eventually be coming down the line.
Same. Mine's better. I've been working on it for years.
I actually had one that was really good when I lost my voice, because it was already built in, but I can't really talk long-winded with it. I can do the yo, this D, and that. If we really want to get into it, Homicide is the one that called to tell me that Rob had gotten picked up on whatever the show was, running away from what he thought was a 14-year-old boy's home. So imagine that phone call in that voice while I'm in art class during my senior year of high school. But we move forward to a no disqualification match inside of a tent at Generation Next in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, May 22nd, 2004. This thing gets off before the bell even rings. Homicide attacks Joe, takes a backdrop. Julius Smokes comes in. This thing is nuts.
What a visual, though, man. With all those streamers and D just bumping around in the streamers and rolling around in them and, like, trying to wrap himself up in the streamers. He looked like he was just having so much fun playing with the streamers.
And that's...
Because by the time he rolls out of the ring, he's like a mummy wrapped head to toe in streamers. It was insane.
And that's the thing with D. He's just a big child. Like, his sense of humor and the way he carries himself on screen, like as this thug killer, especially during this match, and everything that happens afterwards. Like, I can't tell you like how legitimate his character portrayed him as because everybody saw it, but the outside the ring Homicide is a funny dude. And he has so many jokes and one-liners and observations that, when he's playing around in the streamers as the quote-unquote mummy or the Yeti, you really, like, get... I don't know. The first time I saw it, I didn't really know Homicide much at that point. But when I got to know him, and then I recently went back and watched this match, I thought, okay, I see why that's happening now. That makes, because he's just a giant child. But this was incredible. This match. This was the most brutal, like, out of control. Anything goes in this match, and it's in a tent, so it looked awesome because you had the element of those guys were so violent with each other that the tent was going to collapse on all the fans. And I always thought that was an interesting little backdrop to the scene, I guess. Talk a little bit about why this show was in a tent and the whole circumstance behind this show.
Well, the first thing I wanted to say about this match besides the streamers, is that going back and watching it, who did I notice front row in one of the corners as Joe was about to do some face washing was Maddie. Sitting right there.
The great Matthew Bremenkamp. Shout out Bremenkamp. That's my guy.
Awesome dude.
Pusher, the greatest of the greats.
But like the tent thing, my recollection is that there was a last-minute deployment, and the armory needed a building for actual military purposes, and we got bumped to the outside with the tent. and we had enough notice we could plan it. I think it was like the week of we found out. It wasn't like the Connecticut clusterfuck where it was kind of thrown at us last minute. We were scrambling day of.
Where did you guys acquire this tent?
Well, it's this store that's going out of business soon called Tents R Us.
Ah, yes, Tents R Us. Very familiar with that.
Yeah, they're being put out of business by the online version of Tents.com.
Oh, tragic.
But it was one of those things. It was, we wouldn't set it up. Then it was just, all right, let's get it. Let's do it. Let's have this show under here, and get the lights under there. And thank God the weather was good for this one, and it was on concrete and not mud, and it was just awful. It created a really, really awesome environment for the show, especially considering everything that happened on this show, which I'm sure we'll do Generation Next by itself at some point because it is a hallmark show in the progression of the company. But for the chaos of what happens in this match, the chaos of the entire Generation Next thing, the tent was ended up being a perfect environment for the events of this show.
And there's only 350 people or so at the event itself because of the size of the tent. You were kind of limited in what you could do. And they made the most of the situation. They maximized their space.
Yeah, I remember just watching the match from outside of the tent a little bit, literally sitting in me and Alice in Danger and I think one of the Yakers just sitting in an open van that we had parked that was back there, just sitting in the back of the van watching the show, and just kind of amazed at how rabidly hot this crowd was given the circumstances. I mean, it was May, it was hot, it was outside unexpectedly for a lot of fans, and everyone rolled with it, and it turned out that the fans and everything made it a great environment. And when you get a match like this title match that's just hard hitting, and you're seeing Joe and Homicide just beat the hell out of each other and throwing bombs and busting out the Abdullah fork, which I swear that this was a plastic fork in this match's case. They throw everything at each other, and you end up getting it builds that finish that's just goes back to that lariat finish that we talked about before. He nails the lariat, and that doesn't even do it. So we see Joe bust out a fucking brain buster.
Yeah, it's something he's never gone to, and that puts Homicide away at 19 minutes and 59 seconds. And it led to kind of a temper tantrum, almost, you could say, for Homicide. And it led to Gabe on commentary, I guess I shouldn't say Gabe on commentary. It was actually Chris Lovey on commentary screaming, "Evacuate." So at this point in time, as I promised, I'm going to attempt to yell "evacuate" the way Gabe yelled, Chris Lovey, sorry Gabe, yelled "evacuate" at the end of this show in case that tent was going to collapse. So here we go. I'm going to blow my voice out. Cover your ears at home. Evacuate! It sounded a little something like that, but significantly more obnoxious. And as I'm looking at the screen and seeing the audio bounce up and down, that I think I just broke the computer. But no, this was really the culmination of their feud. It needed a little bit of a break, and they really hit a home run here, an absolute home run. Given the event circumstances, just a grand slam home run. But next, speaking of grand slam home runs, we run into Dayton, Ohio, the Montgomery County Fairgrounds. May they rest in peace. It is World Title Classic. So, spoiler alert, Montgomery County Fairgrounds is an important building in Ring of Honor's legacy. This is Joe Punk 1. The date officially for this show was June the 12th, 2004. Like I said, Montgomery County Fairgrounds in Dayton. And Samoa Joe and CM Punk, 60-minute draw. Arguably the start of the greatest trilogy in Ring of Honor history. The initial DVD that we were working off of, A Championship Legacy, doesn't give us the whole match. You can find that somewhere else. Possibly Honor Club, I don't know. But or eBay. And you can check out this match. This is a 5-star match, according to the pundits out there. So, Shane, give us a little bit more detail, because you were in the office and part of the company at this point, and I wasn't at this show.
One thing that's weird to think about is the fact that that match wasn't even the main event. The main event was the very first Ultimate Endurance match. And if I remember correctly, like going into the show too, it was the show wasn't even called World Title Classic. I think the show was originally called Ultimate Endurance, and Gabe ended up changing the name of the show after what this match ended up being. But it also ended up being a pivotal day in my life, a pivotal week in my life, and a pivotal day in company history that really set Joe and Punk up as the figureheads for Ring of Honor. Going into this week, I couldn't remember the exact details, and I did not, go into research mode to find them, because I was just going off of my personal memory of how events unfolded. Earlier in that week, we were at the training facility, and the original owner of Ring of Honor was changing the locks on the doors from the outside of the building, which was into a warehouse where the school was, to the office itself. And none of us knew what was going on. And I got fired from my job at GameStop. Drove back home to Michigan to spend a few days there before I went down to Dayton for the show, only to get a phone call about craziness was going on. I can't remember exactly who called me or texted me, if it was one of the guys in my class, but for some reason I feel like it might have been Zach Yeager. I'm not 100%.
Shout out, Zach.
So when I show up at the building, Zach is the first person I see, and he's just kind of standing in the middle of the fairgrounds laughing with his hands up like this, and just like, okay, what the fuck?
For those that don't know, explain who Zach Yeager is and why he is one of the single greatest human beings in the history of Ring of Honor.
Zach Yeager was one of the core security guys for Ring of Honor that you would remember, being at ringside. Say about 6 foot tall, thick dude, like football player, heavy build. He was an amateur wrestler in high school, and just a big wrestling fan who grew up with like Rich Trapp and Jimmy Fetterman, who were also cameramen and worked in the office. And Zach, his brother Kev, this other dude named Bobby Durkin. These guys were like the security, some of the ring crew. They kind of were an all-purpose role for the company, much in the same way that once the school started, the graduates of the school would come. So Zach was also quite hilarious. Just had a funny mannerisms about him, and despite the fact that he was like 4 or 5 years younger than me, I always thought he looked like he was 4 or 5 years older than me. So he walked in the building, and he's just like, what the fuck? I don't know. He's just kind of like laughing. His hands are up in the air. I don't think like Ross and Sid and them were at the building yet. And it just ended up being that show ended up being a big transition, and because Sal Hamoy came up, we kind of started changing the way we were doing things with the cameras a little bit. Even though you couldn't tell by looking at the video quality of this event, we got a little bit more guidance on the cameras. That's a whole other rant I won't get into, because that will take me a half an hour to rant about. And then it was kind of, okay, well, now this Ring of Honor is now 100% under Kerry Silkin's ownership. Let's go. So this was the first show that was 100% free and clear of the original owner, 100% as far as I understood it under Kerry Silkin, and it was time to go in our direction. And that was a match that, much in the same way that At Our Best was almost like a rebound show from a really traumatic event to the company, World Title Classic, and in particular Joe and Punk's 1 hour draw. Almost it was those two guys taking the company on their back. Obviously there's more people, but really like taking it on themselves as being the two guys to carry the company going forward and say, fuck anyone who tries to stop us, I believe Punk may have said in the promo.
Specific line
that followed this match.
That was the specific line. This match in particular also featured the lone appearance of what may be the ugliest belt in the history of professional wrestling. At the end of the 60-minute draw, Punk and Joe held up this belt.
The medieval title.
Yes, it was it literally looked like it was something you would win at what's the Disney thing? It was in Cable Guy.
Like Medieval Times.
Medieval Times. Thank you. Dinner and the show. This whole bizarre medieval title. It served no purpose. It was in a bag. I don't even know if Joe and Punk had seen it. I asked Joe about it one time, and I know for sure he had not seen it, to the best of his recollection, before they pulled it out of the bag. So when he's holding it up, he's trying not to laugh, which you can clearly see on camera as they're holding up the belt. I don't know if it made the re-release or on any of the best ofs that feature the match in full, but there was a whole post-match speech with Punk, and they're holding up the belt, one hand on each side of the belt, and Joe kind of looks up at it almost like he's staring up into the clouds, and he's looking right at the belt, and he takes his other hand. He had his left hand on the belt, takes his right hand and kind of motions it toward his face before he could kind of recompose himself back into character. It was a horrible looking belt. I have no idea what the purpose or the story or the backstory of this belt was, and there's nothing. There's no references to it that I could find on Google at all.
I wish I could remember who it was that made that belt for us, essentially trying to get our business. That's what it was. It was a sample belt, more or less, of trying to get our business to use that person to make our titles. And I don't know why on earth it got put in front of the cameras at all. I know that it's probably in Kerry's house where most, I believe, of the championship belts are, or at least were when I left. But it was atrocious, and absolutely nobody wanted to use it, and I think that's why we just kind of what did it do? It disappeared with Homicide.
Sounds about right.
With the Homicide moment at the end of this match, that just kind of, we had this epic match, this epic moment to set the stage, and then you have Homicide come in to shit on the whole parade and remind you that he's not done yet with Joe.
And that was kind of the whole theme, because you're coming off of what was almost I would say it was a classic world title match with Joe and Homicide back at Generation Next. And now you're seeing a completely polar opposite classic world title match with CM Punk here at World Title Classic. And if you look at Samoa Joe, the champion, I won't say every match was a home run or a grand slam, but I don't think he had too many base hits or ground balls to the shortstop, to use a baseball analogy. He elevated that belt in such a manner that you never really had before, because the 2 title reigns before this were so short. And, you know, at the time, if you look at 2004, the people that were champions for the bigger companies, you know, at WWE, you had a Raw champion, a SmackDown champion. It was Triple H. It was Undertaker, Kurt, maybe Eddie, those kind of types. They weren't long, drawn-out reigns that were built on the quality of the work that was put into each match. They were built on some goofy story or losing a mask, you know, from Kane's mask when that happened. I think that was around this time. Samoa Joe, to me, is the epitome of what a professional wrestling champion should be. And I don't think, up until this point, as of June 12th, 2004, and I think the show actually finished on June 13th, 2004.
Probably.
Up until that point, I don't know if you had seen a champion exemplify the position the way Samoa Joe did outside of Ric Flair. And I look back on those days and just shake my head at how amazing it was, and how at the time, you know, you're waiting 3 months for a DVD just to see one match. And you're immediately skipping. I would come home from work or from school or wherever I was, and I would skip right to the match, and I would just sit there and watch it over and over and over again. And I mean, I know you probably weren't in much of a position to do that, just in terms of schedule and time and all that, but what was it about this Joe Punk connection here that was so drastically improved from their initial meeting back at Bitter Friends, Stiffer Enemies?
I don't know what the relationship was like, you know, at that point in 2003, but I know by this point in 2004, you had a legitimate friendship, a genuine friendship between the two guys, and you had two people who had really come into their own, both as wrestlers in the ring and as well as their characters and their position within the company. I mean, at this point, you have the two unquestionable leaders of the locker room in Joe and Punk, as far as, you know, people who were kind of the locker room leaders from any perspective I could have possibly looked at it. Regardless of Punk being my trainer, they carried themselves as the guys who were at the top of the heap. I mean, you also, you know, had the people that would have filled into that role if Daniels would have been around at that point. You know, Homicide was obviously at the top too, but it's not his personality to be the guy at the top of the locker room. You know, the one that everyone is kind of that's setting the bar and setting the standard for the rest of the guys to work towards.
He would have been in the back of the room making the jokes as Gabe is making his speeches before the show.
Exactly. So, you know, and it was just that perfect storm of coming in the same week, much as the way at our best did, coming in the same time frame as a big blow up. These two guys went and said, forget all of that bullshit. This right here in the ring is what Ring of Honor is all about. And you would not have known, I don't think, or expected this match. I certainly didn't. This was the first show that I filmed as a cameraman at ringside. I had been doing indies, like some ECWA shows. I did a Jersey All Pro show. Did some World One shows that were taped for the previous owner, and this was the first Ring of Honor show I did, and it was just a match that I had to almost remind myself to pay attention to my job of filming, because it was such an engrossing match. You can watch me in my Michigan State cap at ringside from the hard camera.
It's amazing. You look at the matches that you were ringside for filming early on, and that's kind of how I got to know you a little bit way back in the day. It's such a small world that all these amazing events, and not amazing in terms of positive, but amazing in terms of scope. The landscape of the company is completely flipped on its head. There's a transition from previous ownership to Kerry Silkin, who literally, gave his blood, sweat, and tears and money to this concept of Ring of Honor. And you're ringside for this match. And this was really the start of a whole new chapter for Ring of Honor. A whole lot cleaner of a chapter, I guess you could say. I guess we had initially planned on doing one of these marathon shows, but we're gonna put a bow on this portion of Samoa Joe's 2003 to 2005 after this match, because it's a fitting way to end. You go out on top, like George Costanza, and the only way to describe Samoa Joe was pure class up until this point. He handled himself as the ultimate professional, and he carried that belt with the status of world champion because he believed in that belt. He believed in the company. And I guess, final thoughts from you before we hit the music and get on out of here on Samoa Joe up to this point.
Well, up to this point, one thing I want to mention, because it fits better into this point of the story, and my other Big Joe story kind of will fit better into the second part. The very first time we ever got into the ring, which was during the week of Final Battle 2003, was because Joe was in town early with Punk, and he came into the school with Punk, and we got into the ring not to do any kind of professional wrestling or learn anything. It was, okay, we're going to grapple with Joe and Punk. And all of us are just kind of like, what? Like, yeah, you're gonna get in the ring, and we're gonna go 60 seconds, I think it was, maybe 90 seconds, I don't remember the exact amount of time, with Joe, and then next we'll go through all of us with Joe, and then all of us with Punk. And that was my very first time setting foot inside a pro wrestling ring, was wrestling with Samoa Joe and CM Punk the week of Final Battle 2003. I was very happy and proud of myself to say that I managed to last the 60 or 90 seconds or whatever with Joe without being tapped out. I was very, very proud of myself. That was probably the highlight of the first month of our training.
Is Shane Hagadorn tough guy?
Yeah, exactly. I'll just exaggerate the story too about how I almost tapped out Punk. I had no idea what I was doing in that ring, so I think at one point me and Punk, I had him in a hold, and we were just staring at each other and staring at Joe like, all right, neither of us know what to do right now. And Joe just has this look on his face like, just kind of laughing and chuckling.
The only thing that would have made that better is if Raven was standing there to go, eh. Well, on that note, we're going to slap the porpoise. This one's over for an honorable mention. Part 1, Samoa Joe 2003 to 2005. We didn't quite get to 2005, but let's not let that get in the way of a good title. Slap the porpoise. This one's over. We're out of here. As a friendly reminder, you can find us on all the various social media outlets. Our Twitter handle is @anhonorablepod. You can find me @the Jeff Schwartz. Shane, where can we find you on Twitter?
@Hagadorn Shane.
Our Facebook is facebook.com/anhonorablepod. And our Instagram is @anhonorablepod. So go hit us up on those social media outlets and interact. Give us your opinions, your feedback. We're willing to listen, learn, and maybe even utilize some of your ideas. You can find our podcast, An Honorable Mention, on iTunes, SoundCloud, the Google Music Play Store, Amazon Echo, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and many other places where podcasts can be found. As a friendly reminder as well, the poll is still open for what will come up after the Samoa Joe episodes. Your 4 polling options are At Our Best, which was in 2004, Supercard of Honor 1 in 2005, Supercard of Honor 7 taking place in 2012, and the Phoenix WrestleMania weekend, which took place in 2010. That is a set of shows I've never seen before and don't want to have to see for a first time. So please go vote on any of the poll options. We're ready to do more shows for you. Shane, any final words on those polls?
Vote Phoenix. Vote Phoenix. Vote Phoenix.